And excellent. All right.
Good morning, Grill Country. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day. This is our TLC Saves America live stream. And we're gonna continue the conversation that's been going on in TLC about the decline of liberalism and whether post-liberalism is a good idea or not, and what to the collapse of the post-war consensus and all that kind of good stuff. And we should get some variety of perspectives here. I think Kale is probably the least dedicated liberal in the particular group that I have here today. Marcus is our resident economist here in the corner. He's a classical liberal. He's a Hayek guy. Dr. Jim obviously has made it very clear where he stands in his conversation with me and with Sam. And I've been obviously very vocal, especially on Twitter. And I think everybody knows where I stand at this point. And Kale is kind of like in between, but he's a reasonable guy. And this gives us very interesting here because we have a very broad Christian spectrum. So we have like an evangelical, Catholic, a kind of Anglican, and an Orthodox perspective here on this conversation. So that's good. I actually am going to turn to Dr. Jim to kind of get the ball rolling here, because Dr. Jim, right before we recorded, he had written a piece kind of giving some of his thoughts. So if you wanted to kind of outline what you were thinking to kind of prime the pump for the conversation, Jim, share some of the thoughts that you had in the essay that you wrote on your subject.
Yeah, I wrote it to try to express some degree of nuance to the ideas that I have. Interestingly, after I put it down and then reread it, it feels very much like I'm parroting or paraphrasing the clip that Paul Vanderklay kind of puts up all the time of Tim Keller talking about this. And Tim Keller's very clear. He's such a well-spoken guy. And I'm kind of realizing that a lot of what I said in there is pretty much exactly what he said. And, I'll try to paraphrase it, but I want to start with something a little different. And that is that first, I think my commitment to liberalism, in the sense that we've been talking about it, is because I'm a boomer. I mean, I maybe I've over years resisted that label, but in more recent years, I've come to realize, I'm squarely a boomer in a lot of different ways. And being a boomer, looking over the horizon, given the fact that we're late boomer here at best, if not already at the end of the boomer generation, I don't really have the ability to kind of look past that horizon and see what it is that might be coming. It's hard for me to visualize what that would be. And so, kind of emotionally, I'm a boomer. And I think in the end, there's a whole lot of the classical liberal kind of ideas that are kind of baked into that generation. I would say that the article was an attempt to trace the history of this in a kind of simplistic way, that we started with a principle-based classical liberalism. And that concept of classical liberalism, that use of that vocabulary in some time immemorial in the past, was clear and represented the kind of principled base of, individual rights, limited government, et cetera. But that as time went by, it got co-opted by progressive liberalism. And so we ended up with this confusion in vocabulary, or lack of clarity in vocabulary, in distinguishing progressive liberalism, or liberal as opposed to conservative, and the classical liberal definition. And I saw that just recently in the videos that Paul talked about, that of stories of old was talking about progressive liberalism in that, and yet using the term liberal to talk about it. And you, Nate, very well, when you were talking to Sam, articulated the classical liberalism use of that term. And those two things, I first wanted to say in my article that, dang it, don't talk about one when you're meaning the other. Be clear about what you're talking about here. And then as I developed that idea, I realized, well, that is exactly the problem. That's exactly what happened, was that we started with this principled notion of liberalism, which would align with, frankly, conservative ideals more than it would liberal ideals in our contemporary use of that. But then the progressive liberal dominance in our culture co-opted the kind of vocabulary and categories of that classical liberalism and kind of merged the two, or confused or muddled those two definitions, to the point where when we were late in this and there was a conservative reaction against it, the conservative reaction against it also is unable to distinguish those two things and attacks the whole of it, and ultimately is undermining those original principles in a kind of, not very self-consciously clear way. In other words, they're just throwing the whole thing out.
Jim, I would say that the right's move to lump liberals and progressives in together that's a recent phenomenon that's occurred, like in the right kind of flexing its muscle post-Trump victory. Now that Trump has won, it's like they act like they don't need the liberals anymore. So the liberals are just getting lumped in with progressives as if liberals and progressives were exactly the same in the online discourse. And right. I see that happening all the time. But that's a very, very recent phenomenon. Up until the point when Trump was elected, like classical liberals were very much part of the coalition that brought Trump into office.
Well, I just to push back a little bit on that, or maybe with a question, Nate, do you see, are we talking about Trump's victory in 2024? Or are we talking about Trump's victory in 2016? Because I do think that they reveal different things.
This is hyper recent. It did not happen in 2016.
Well, but it did on some level, right, Nate? Because if you recall, there was a, think about the role of sort of I don't want to, the words are tough here, but like the traditional right of center sense makers leading up to the first Trump victory. You think of like the National Review crowd, you think of somebody like Jonah Goldberg or David French or the guys at the Dispatch. They were very much allergic, quite allergic to Trump's first victory. And there might be a way of sort of understanding where we are, kind of watching how they have reacted as sort of out loud conservatives leading up and into and through Trump 1.0, and the sort of the different group of people who sort of pushed Trump 2.0 over the finish line. And again, I know I
get your point, Cale, but they were largely between 2016 and the most recent election. They were almost all, with the exception of a few outliers who will always remain never Trumpers. They mostly had been brought into the fold. And the Trump's coalition had lots and lots of liberals in it. Like they were
brought into the fold kicking and screaming in a number of different ways. But
yeah, I'm not arguing against that, Nate. I'm certainly not arguing against that. But I listened to them quite a bit, both in the sort of the first Trump run and the second Trump run, or third one, whatever. And the question that I kept circling back to me was, these were real, if you remember, like your Jonah Goldbergs and that specific generation, those guys are a couple of clicks older than me, but not that much. That sort of first wave of young Gen X conservatives in the early aughts.
Yeah, that's me. That's me, Cale.
Yeah. No, that's fine. and look, and largely me too, Nate. I mean, I'm not.
As well. Yeah.
I think that there's an interesting generational aspect to this. Jim, you were talking about as a kind of boomer, both sort of historically and spiritually, a kind of boomer. The Gen Xers seem to be much more ripped apart by this on the intellectual side of things than the boomer side of things. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense.
Well, can I say one thing first to go back to Jim's original comments, which is, one of my professors, probably who had the biggest influence on me in terms of the specific species of classical liberalism that I developed was Dan Klein at George Mason. And he developed a website at one point called Lost Language, Lost Liberalism. I put it in the chat. I'm going to put it in the chat again. And it's basically saying, you know, over the last 150 years, there has been a slow shift in what people mean by liberalism, because sometimes in politics, there becomes a lot of confusion between different things. So specifically in the 1870s or something like that in Britain, people, when Malcolm Gladstone's party came into fore, people actually started at the time distinguishing between the new liberalism and the old liberalism. The old liberalism being what we call today classical liberalism. Right? But liberalism from around that time to about the time of Klein's argument is that David Hume and Adam Smith are some of the christeners of that term liberalism in its political meaning, exactly what it would mean to be a liberal, both in your politics, the way you understand the structure of a government, and your economic policy. And that same sense of liberal got imported into somewhere like France by people like Benjamin Constant and Madame de Stael and Francois Guizot and stuff like that. But it was later on that there was a split between different camps within liberalism, some of which were far more comfortable increasing the size and scope of the state in these various domains, sometimes for Christian motivated reasons or something like that, or other ideological motivated reasons, or they thought we need to expand the scope of the state to save liberalism in some way. But it's unclear if that was a necessary bargain.
Can I ask you a question? Because it sounds like you have a good grasp on this kind of historical stuff, which interests me. How would you talk about the post-war consensus? How would you? I would assume that you would maybe want to label it something like a neoliberalism, and in other words, a new kind of rebranding or re-energizing of this classical liberal notion, or how would you talk about what the post-war consensus really is?
I'm not sure. I'm not as great a history as you might think, but a lot of what's happening after the Cold War is like a victory lap, right? Or sorry, after World War II is a big victory lap, right? And in economics, one of the things that's a part of is during the Great Depression, it was slowly becoming consensus among many economists, both in academic economics and those in charge of economic policy, that capitalism had in some sense failed, right? Because communism was on the rise in Russia, and different forms of fascism were on the rise in Italy and Germany. And these seem to be working, you know, from a glance, from a distance, if you don't have the information, these seem to be actually
the time
working.
horizon. Yeah, within a circumscribed timeline, it was working very much.
Yeah. And then the Great Depression happens, and then you go, okay, well, this capitalism thing is destined to fail. Well, they might not even always call it capitalism, but the market or something like that is destined to fail. And so the idea of Keynesian economics, which actually shows up kind of after a lot of the New Deal policies, his book comes out after the New Deal policies. It doesn't directly influence them. Comes to be seen as sort of a middle of the road thing where you have a little bit more government to save a whole free market system. And so that kind of economics that is actually very interventionist in the economy and is interested in expanding the scope of government becomes to be associated with capitalism in the 50s and 60s. And then other forms of expansion around the globe and expansion of the government around this time, they're conflated with the capitalist side of the Cold War. So one comment that I'll just make is in a lot of these post-war consensus discussions that I'm seeing, there's very little comment given to the whole Cold War period that happens after World War II. So like Pajot basically says something like, oh, well, you know, we beat the Nazis, good for us. They were the bad guys, we were the good guys roughly, but we bargained with the bad guys too. Well, we were very clear right after that they were also the bad guys, you know, for 30 years or so. So that's another wrinkle in the story a little bit. But
though that sort of required FDR to die. Right.
Yeah,
you know, the FDR, again, I read so much stuff over the years. I have this memory of Churchill being extremely frustrated with FDR because FDR was in his way of thinking way too cozy with Stalin. And so with so there was all kinds of drama at Yalta and whatnot. And so when he dies and is replaced by Truman, right, that the Americans became much more sort of programmatically anti-communist you know, and of course that was solidified, I think, by the way that the Red Army behaved in the defeat in the aftermath of the defeat in the East. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was pretty you know, I think most of us can, I think, safely say it was pretty barbaric stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of the even before to FDR's character too, even before the war, a lot of the economists, I'm thinking of people like Rexford Tugwell, who were part of his New Deal apparatus and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They were all economists who had studied in Germany under the German tradition of economics that was all about organization, planning, top-down stuff. Capitalism, the market seems to have failed. So let's start to run the company or the country like it's a company, right? Where we tell people what to do, blah, 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 things like that.
I think Paul in the comments here talks about the post-war consensus really has an A and B phase. The divide is the counterculture. I think that's very right. I think that, and I would say in a lot of ways, like the counterculture is more responsible for a lot of the things that people are complaining about than the post-war consensus. I would also, on the historical point, like I do think that essentially the post-war consensus is to some degree synonymous with neoliberalism, and some post-liberals even know that is the case. Because if you look at like the form of post-liberalism I find least gross,
I love it.
Is the kind of Milbankian post-liberalism, and Milbank and Pabst are pretty clear that what they're reacting to is the consensus in the UK and in the States over the last 40 years, and it's mostly on the economic side that they have a problem.
But it's an interesting,
well, they have cultural issues too. But it's
but it's interesting how those, like, they kind of embed themselves in one another in interesting ways. You know, you think of like what Blair does in the UK. You know, it is neoliberalism, isn't it? And therefore the sort of the culture, the cultural revolution stuff gets kind of embedded. It's sort of it's good business to, for instance, make expand the tax base by 2 adults per household instead of 1, which is, as I think Louise Perry was saying the other day, very convenient for the government in terms of expanding the tax base, but it's kind of a one-time gain, and the gains that show up on a spreadsheet manifest themselves as costs in a different kind of spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
The family, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
I'm, as I think you picked out there, Cale. I'm more on the kind of cultural or spiritual side of this in terms of my zeitgeist about it. I feel, I feel to be a boomer culturally, if you will. But I have this structuring of it that is separate from the economic part of it, that is kind of related to the conversation that Jonathan Pageau has had concerning Hitler as being the great evil. And Marcus, you mentioned this. I actually think that the model of sincerity and moving to authenticity is a very good way for me to visualize where I'm at. And rather than Hitler being the big bugaboo, I take the character of Rolf in The Sound of Music as the concerning image. And if you remember this character, he was the love interest of one of the high school age girl in the family. And he's a sincere guy. By that, I mean, he has sincerity written all over him. He is following the rules of living. He's living into the, roles that he has been given, and he's doing it with aplomb and very, and he would be the perfect match for her were not the backdrop what it was. And there's this classic moment, of course, where he has this choice. The choice is, do I choose to let them go, or do I play my role in the broader culture? And of course, we know what he chooses. Mm-hmm. That's if you will, let's say the death of sincerity, or sincerity is no longer an option for the culture, and
because it reveals a deeper value that he was there. up until that point unaware of, I think, right? And I wonder if, Nate, one of your sort of your fear, your fear about kind of what you're seeing is sort of the rise of the Rolfs, that in the movie, of course, he breaks toward a value that the four of us, I think, would celebrate, right? But maybe the sense that you're having, Nate, is that what if Rolf makes the wrong choice in this sort of crucial A/B test? In a different scenario, you could imagine Rolf very much turning the family in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Gen Z, so I don't know this movie at all.
Well, Rolf does turn them in. Rolf blows the whistle,
right? But
he does turn them in, and that's he chooses the Nazis, if you will. And the way I envision that as being so problematic back then, because I think we're now way past that. But the way I see it as problematic then is that we were suspicious of conformity. The culture of conformity let us down in this major way in which we saw in the World War II. So now authenticity is born, where everything centers on self-expression, finding yourself and expressing yourself. And that ultimately is counter to the, kind of any kind of sincerity culture. And we see that playing out in culture with all the markers of counterculture. Long hair. You move through the whole history of my, let's say, musical life is all about that kind of countercultural markers that are countercultural. The problem with that, of course, is it relies on the prior sincerity culture being a foe or a something to act against. And I think we're late in this now, where authenticity, if you will, has become the dominant. The boomers are dominant, and they are controlling everything. And now you get the counter reaction to that. And
it's not like, here's the thing though, it's not like the counterculture is the only thing that ever pointed at authenticity. Like, have you read any Lonergan at all, Cale?
I've not.
Like, authenticity is actually really important for Lonergan.
Yeah.
On the Catholic side. So there's
how so? If you could just give me a quick.
I've taken one class on Lonergan, and I don't know him well enough to really speak well to that. I just know
he's one of Barron's. He's one of Barron's lights.
What was that?
He's one of Bishop Barron's lights. He points to Lonergan quite a bit.
Yeah, he's kind of like, Lonergan's interesting. He's kind of like trying to, without breaking with the kind of like standard Catholic scholastic framework too radically, he's trying to move beyond it in a kind of interesting way. I actually noted the thing that I picked up on. The thing that I really picked up on Lonergan was a certain overlap with Barfield, and kind of sensing like there's a sort of evolution of consciousness, almost kind of part of his thought, like especially when he thinks about like the meaning versus like the kind of pre-linguistic experience that we have. It's very reminiscent of Barfield to me. But I'm just saying that authenticity is like, it's not like authenticity is not something that only the hippie counterculture,
it's a larger spirit.
Picked up on as important. And I think we can all recognize that there's like something like authenticity does really have some legitimate weight to it. Like we would all prefer to interact with people who are authentic.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, as a Gen Xer, that was very much I would argue that the great download that I received from my boomer teachers was absolutely authenticity. And as a young man, that was absolutely my North Star.
Yeah.
What I guess what I have encountered is that was somehow not fully real, or that those people that I thought were authentic turned out to not be fully authentic.
Right.
Yeah, or as authenticity progressed, the
A
need
performative
growing
kind of
long hair
yes.
in the 70s.
like play acting on authenticity.
Right.
But
So it go ahead.
can we not give it an affordance that
Mm.
maybe, like so many other things in life, you have to play act it a little bit before it becomes a reality?
I mean,
So it's
yeah.
like you have to try out being authentic before you become a genuinely authentic person. I actually think that, in my experience, some of that, like, you can't really be authentic until you reach a certain age in life, and you have no shits left to give. Like,
yeah.
that's where I'm at. That's why I'm so much more vocal.
Yeah.
About certain things.
I was trying to imagine authenticity, though, as a reaction against, and therefore it has to have the markers of being non-conformist. And so you see, and I see this in music best, but I think it is broader than this. But you see something like, let's say Long Hair in the late 70s. You see David Byrne and Talking Heads. He has to have the marker of not being conventional. That has
but Jim, remember,
and that moves to Kurt Cobain in a kind of
but you skipped an important part of the music story, right? Which is punk. Punk was this sort of reaction to the excesses of hippiedom and post-hippiedom, right? I mean, it was sort of this.
Yeah, it's complex and nuanced for sure.
Yeah, but I watched the other day the Netflix. It was on Netflix. It was the Led Zeppelin documentary, and it was very good. I don't know if you saw it, but it was basically like how did it's the genesis of Led Zeppelin in the destruction of the Yardbirds, right? And and so they have some great archival footage, which is historically very difficult to come across with Led Zeppelin. Like, they very much held on to a lot of this stuff, and they wouldn't allow anything on YouTube for years and years and years. And Jimmy Page was very protective, which you see in him talking about what he wanted to do with Led Zeppelin. And he was adamantly opposed to like a single. No track on a Led Zeppelin album was going to like be able to be cut up and put on AM radio, right? He was all about FM radio and playing the whole album. So he was sort of this like high concept guy, right? And you can see that kind of degenerates into a kind of decadence that I think punk rock music, and not just against Led Zeppelin, but was very much was working kind of against that, the pretense, of that 70s.
There's certainly always a kind of a ironic element that always is kind of riding alongside, although punk is bigger than that. Where I was trying to go, though, in terms of the final, maybe land this plane back towards the end of something, is the Grateful Dead. And the reason I would pick them out is, first off, they were a big part of my youth. Second off, they've been around forever. And finally, they are now in Las Vegas.
They really have been around forever.
Sorry?
I just wanted to point out, like, the Grateful Dead, in terms of the longevity of the Grateful Dead, I actually had a friend that was younger than me, that like was from Connecticut, who was traveling around following the Dead when they were back. This was like in the early, like the late 90s, probably.
They were huge up here in the late 90s. Yeah, Nate, huge.
And now where are they? This is the point I was getting. Now where are they? They've got John Mayer, and they're in the Globe in Las Vegas.
Right.
And the ticket prices are $1,000, $500-$600 a seat. This is peak Boomer, and Boomer owning the world in terms of economics, and yet it's also the end, because you can just see that it's they're on the
it's on the clock. It's on the clock. Yeah,
it's on the clock.
Yeah,
and and it's decadent in the way that you were talking about, Cale. And also, I love the fact that it also goes right along with the imagery of the Grateful Dead, where you have skulls with flowers coming out of them. I mean, it's like they're living on a corpse.
And clearly, of all of the sort of of all of the bands of the 60s and 70s, no band is more religious like than the Grateful Dead, with liturgies and scriptures and recordings. I mean, it is in and of itself, it's a whole religion, and it's a way of life, and it inspires devotion in ways I don't think there's any other band that comes close to it.
You were mentioning, Cale, about your experience with Nine Inch Nails. I had this experience with other bands as well, but with the Grateful Dead, I would go, if they were local, I would go to every concert.
Right.
And so that element of it is definitely there, but I find the image of them being a kind of marker of the cultural end of something. Exactly what's coming after of it, I don't know, but the end of something is indicated.
I never went to a Grateful Dead concert. I just bought acid from Deadheads.
Right. Well, it's a good source. I mean, good source.
Anyway, I don't know if that kind of dials.
Well, I actually want to point out. Let's talk about the counterculture thing and like the role of counterculture, and like what is the function of? I wonder what is the function of counterculture in a liberal society. I think is the question I want to ask, and I also think that we have to point out that what's going on the right now is a countercultural movement.
Yeah, things have flipped.
And also the other thing is that there's always been a kind of like, I have a friend who's who I went to Thomas Aquinas College with, who lives in Russia, and we've talked about this a lot because because I'm kind of a hippie, but I'm also kind of conservative, and he's like no. He's like, actually, there's always been this sort of like hippie bohemian element in the right all along.
Yeah, I was going to say,
what's funny is that the people in the dissident right are so like me.
Yeah.
They have the same kind of like tastes and sensibilities. Yeah. But they have adopted a completely different set of political beliefs, and I've read their books. It's like I know where they're getting their ideas, but I don't find the ideas compelling in the way that they do. So it's kind of interesting that like I'm so close to them in so many ways, and yet when it comes to politics, I'm very far apart. And part of it is like, even though I have those aesthetics, I don't really have a countercultural kind of orientation. I actually am more properly conservative in the true sense of the word, and I get concerned when people want to take things too far too fast.
Yeah,
in radical ways.
Yeah. I think. Well, so then I guess I would pose the question to you, and maybe part of what's been happening in the last couple of weeks or a couple of months is answering the question already, but what do you wish to preserve or conserve, do you think, Nate?
Yeah, I want to preserve Americanism. I think Americanism is good and has produced good results and is not the same. Like, there's a difference between the kind of liberalism that gets attacked by post-liberals doesn't really represent Americanism, in my opinion. I think Americanism has a lot of features that set it apart from the European liberal tradition, which is mostly what they focus their attacks on.
Right.
But America is completely different, and liberalism on American soil is different.
Yeah.
It's a complete like lightning in a bottle, basically, the ability to write a constitution and for it actually to last that long. And within somewhat in the same bounds. But I will disagree a little bit, Nate, in that America, like McMo made a comment at some point earlier that something like liberalism is the velvet glove on the American fist.
Yeah, I saw that.
When it comes to like a lot of other policies around the world, nation building over here or state building over here or blah, 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 or we got to intervene over here to save liberalism in some sense. So there's many different, liberalism only functions for certain kinds of domains, right? Mm-hmm. And this was very conscious to a lot of the early liberal theorists, right? So liberalism, a sense that we have the rule of law, or we have a government that constrains itself and governs itself by these various rules. They stick to a certain domain. So they're responsible for protecting property rights, or they're responsible for regulating trade in these basic ways. That works because those domains are more amenable to describing rules such that we can constrain an executive or the magistrate by the rule of law, right? But over time, certain kinds of domains get entered into by the government, or sometimes it's thrust into them by external events, such that liberal norms can't be generated on the spot to describe exactly how we govern this particular domain. So the main example that I think of is something like public schooling or mass public schooling, right? So, okay, in principle, it might be okay to say we have a liberal government that introduces some policy that says, well, we're going to have taxpayer-funded schools and kids up to 10 years old can go to them, like primary schooling kind of thing, right? Okay, that's something. If we pass it through the legislature, we go by the means of the Constitution, that all works. But what's going to get taught in those schools? How does that get decided? And all of a sudden, that gets thrust into this whole other cultural domain in which the things that we were hoping to say, this is those different religious or ethnic or cultural or scientific differences, those are the things which we generated liberal so that we could have toleration about. All of a sudden, you can't tolerate the toleration. Because if you don't, put your couple of teachers in the school, then your kids are going to come out with an entirely different culture. So it basically creates a little battle arena of illiberalism sponsored by the liberal state. So there has to be, there's so many other domains that a liberal nation needs to realize it can't go in that direction, or else it loses its ability to be liberal. Liberalism only works for certain kinds of parts of the world, in a sense, or certain kinds of human activities can only be governed by rules in a certain kind of way. This is basically the theme throughout all of Adam Smith's work, even his moral philosophy.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it part of the kind of sense of what classical liberalism is a certain kind of restraint,
Mm-hmm.
And that should open the
just
door to communities, schools, religious communities
but
being
I'd say,
illiberal in their domains.
Yes,
Yeah.
but so that I'd say what the weakness of liberalism, and this is a weakness that I'd like to protect it from, in a sense, is the fact that it governs itself, or it communicates itself, usually by explicit rules. So in some sense, liberalism is very left-brained in that it says, this is what the government does. And we all come from different religions, different cultures, different languages, possibly even. You got to learn the language, I guess, if you're going to read the rules. But it might not be your first language or something like that. And these rules make very clear what stepping over the bounds means for the executive or for the legislature. It makes very clear what unconstitutional means, right? So when we're in domains when those rules are unclear, we risk losing our liberalism, or we risk sort of spilling all over the floor or something like that, right? Or end up developing some mutant appendage to the liberal society that we don't know how to control with liberal norms, so we control it by illiberal norms. So that kind of goes back to the counterculture thing. When especially when we're having debates over the government, we're having debates over these other parts of society which are not governed by liberalism, culture and counterculture, and these kinds of struggles that feel very illiberal, they come to the forefront, right? And we have those combats, right?
I just want to say this about counterculture really quick. I think there's something healthy about having a counterculture. Because
it's inevitable.
The function of a counterculture is a counterculture shows, it exposes to you the things that the main culture is blind to.
Correct. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And so I think that there's a lot of tendency in TLC to kind of act as if everything that came out of the counterculture of the 60s was bad. And certainly there were some negative effects of it, but there were also good things. There were genuine blind spots that the mainstream culture had that the counterculture pointed out. The problem, where you get into problems, is that when the counterculture begins to take over the mainstream culture, then you run into problems.
Right. That's the whole parasite, boundary versus center, discussion that Pajot injects into this, which I think is very, very helpful. But I wonder if there's a third position to this cultural, mainstream cultural thing that I think that is what got exposed ultimately. Nate, you said in the stream the other day, something along you gave a kind of genealogy of TLC as a reaction to the IDW, right?
Yeah.
When I heard that, I was with you about 75% of the way. And if memory serves, you said something to the effect of that the TLC was formed in the kind of the sort of the deep allergic reaction to the IDW to sort of police speech or something like that. Is that ringing a bell, Nate? Sorry, I'm.
Yeah.
That was in the conversation.
I think I can actually I think Benjamin Boyce is an obvious example of like the person I could point to who has been most transformed, because when Boyce started out, he was a classical liberal.
Yeah.
Who very much was like in line with like most of the rest of the voices in this space were like slightly right of center, definitely uncomfortable with the illiberalism of the progressives, very strongly critiquing that. And then over time, for whatever reasons, have gradually shifted further and further toward a more reactionary kind of politics and have become hostile to liberalism. A lot of them, not all of them, obviously. I'm still
that's fine.
a liberal.
Yeah. Well, I guess I think like when I think of my own attraction to the TLC and I track with that story about the IDW, et cetera, you know, my reaction was that I felt that the liberals ultimately lied to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so my attraction to this is like I want to get to the bottom of that lie, which leads me, of course, to this conversation about the post-war consensus. And lie might be a little bit of a strong word, but I'm just trying to make sense out of my own allergy.
Cale, I like that. I like that comment. Can you just clarify a little bit back to my starting point? When you said liberal in those few sentences, what do you mean?
Well, I mean right liberals and left liberals, right?
Okay, so you mean progressive liberalism versus conservatism.
Yeah, but conservative liberals and progressive liberals. I mean, I think that part of the post-liberal critique in that regard is correct. I think that most of American politics up until the last couple of years, and maybe this is part of your reaction, Nate, but most of that politics was really done amongst liberals and finding themselves on different sides of the playground.
You had right liberals and left liberals, and there was nothing else.
And so for instance, somebody like Jonah Goldberg and George Will and all of these sort of the all-star class, and those are multi-generational, you know, I think what got exposed to me is like, well, what exactly were they trying to conserve? And it seems to me, from my vantage point, it seems to me that what they were much more concerned about conserving was not the stuff that I cared about. Right. And so what I see in emerging, and again, there's all kinds of things that need to be sifted and disambiguated, et cetera, is that they very much lived up to the kind of centralized stereotype of this sort of the DC ruling class, as opposed to sort of all of these far-flung localities that got churned up by the right and left liberal consensus, which, you know, burrowed out the flyover country, you know. And again, I don't want to talk about J.D. Vance now. That's a different conversation. But the J.D. Vance that I read in Hillbilly's Elegy was very much sort of like, well, what happened? Remember, you know, Bill Clinton signed NAFTA, but let's remember that NAFTA and free trade and all that that was very much Reagan and Bush 1 ethos stuff, right?
Now, I come from the libertarian sphere of things in terms of politics, and I don't know if you've ever heard the term Beltway libertarians.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's right.
So Beltway being the 495 around DC, right? And so at some point, I'm not sure when this term developed, but I think it was maybe even like something like 20, 30 years ago when there were various schisms in the libertarian movement. The institutions which had established themselves in the center of DC so that can actually do lobbying and wheelhousing and stuff like that were things like people like the Cato Institute and Reason and to some degree Mercatus, which, full disclosure, I've been a part of Mercatus before. They funded my PhD, as opposed to other more far-flung organizations, especially that ended up living primarily online. And the main one, the most popular one, is something like the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which was run by Rothbard after he had a split from Cato back in the 80s. Right. Some say they kicked him out, some said it was a split.
So as a sort of part of the historical record, you all know that I'm friends with Rod, but do you remember the reaction to the National Review crowd when he came out with Crunchy Cons? Like, the scorn was just dripping. I mean, they you know, so for part of my sort of initial sort of eyebrow raise, which became somewhat of a wake up, quote unquote, was that I realized that the professional conservative class was not religious at all. They didn't care about the things that I cared about. right? They had a different orienting value than I did as a sort of a religious conservative, I guess you would call me. But like Nate, like I'm basically a conservative with hippie tendencies, and you're basically a hippie with
Yeah, I felt
conservative
Rod was
tendencies.
Rod in those days. I felt Rod was very much speaking for me. Like that's
Yeah.
like very much the kind of like
Yeah.
I said, it's like that's like my friend from Thomas Aquinas, who, you
Right.
know, like that kind of like
and in those
hippie conservative that I am.
right, but
Like
in
that
those
was very
alternative
much.
in those alternative Catholic spaces, because I went to Thomas More, which is like Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
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 It was always we used to make this joke all the time. There were those people who came to this sort of alternative conservative Catholic school by way of National Review, and those that came to these alternative Catholic schools by way of like a kind of crunchy trad, hardcore trad position. And it was sort of an interesting mix of
Well, it's funny because
way.
Rod appealed to me. I was reading Rod in National Review, but I actually went to Thomas Aquinas because I saw an ad in National Review.
Yeah,
like that's how I ended up at Thomas
right,
Aquinas.
Right.
Yeah.
Similar for me, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
So I'll say though, I've also noticed that trend, and I mean with libertarians, it's very explicit. Libertarians are maybe in a sense then the more honest conservatives, because they're like, well, we're the classical liberals that are not necessarily Christian. We're maybe okay with gay marriage and drugs and all that, right? But that's almost like a set of policy positions. But one thing I've noticed among the libertarians of my generation is they are far more likely to be religious or to be concerned with these religious things, and the groups, the more radical libertarians, they are more likely to have become religious to the extent that they've become almost illiberal about certain things.
Yeah.
So people have noticed for a while, or people used to call it something like the libertarian to alt-right pipeline.
Yes.
When people were still using the word alt-right, which I realized they don't anymore. And part of that is because the big fun debates to have around 2017, 2018 were all of the gender, Jordan Peterson pronouns, all those kinds of debates. So those just attract young people's attention. But I think partly what I noticed is because that crowd, the more radical libertarians, the Murray Rothbard types, they're the ones that trend, and Murray Rothbard in the 80s, 90s allied with Pat Buchanan types, right? That was a very strange bedfellows moment that a lot of people don't know about. And I've sort of started to develop a theory of why that is, and I kind of escaped it because I was more of a Rothbardian in high school and then became more of a Hayek Smithian when I came to college because of the influences there. But to some degree, what Rothbard offers you is very simple. Hey, I want a society, anarcho-capitalist, no government. It's everything is governed by am I punching you in the face or not? If I'm not punching you in the face, it's okay, right?
And that's the spirit. And that's the spirit of for Goldberg's liberal fascism, right?
Yeah.
That's the animating spirit of that book. Is like it's sort of the leave me alone crew.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but what the problem with Rothbard's form of political theory is that it's radically incomplete for all of the actual kinds of coordination and things that you need to organize around, right? So when you go into the deep Rothbard theories or whatever, you end up with these situations like, well, what if you have someone in your society that doesn't want to follow the libertarian property ethic norms? Oh, well, you can just kill them. You can just throw them out. So
discard.
If in a sense the property ethic norm is supposed to be our very clear liberal rule, right? Yeah. As soon as you step outside of the domain where that rule is a little bit unclear, it's not unclear how it's going to be stabilized, there's no governing ethic whatsoever. So those types of people are actually much more willing to accept completely illiberal, unconstitutional people in government because they already accept that's far beyond the field of what their ethics can even speak about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So you end up just sort of, it's like a kid in a candy store all of a sudden where there's no ethics for what you can say or dislike or like or whatever.
So that's interesting, Marcus. That is very informative for me because I've always been kind of libertarian adjacent, but I'm also like very Anabaptist adjacent. So it's not like my libertarianism definitely has a theological kind of underpinning. It's not completely, it's not divorced from my theology at all. It's actually very closely wedded to my theology. So I've always found it perplexing when libertarians make these moves toward authoritarianism. It's just bizarre to me.
The big
but that kind of explains how that could happen.
The big thing ends up being over immigration. So
yeah.
Which is, if those are borders, then why not just say this is the border? If the government's going to exist, they can do whatever they want, but we also want no government. So it's a very ambiguous, because since that kind of anarcho-capitalism is functionally untenable, it ends up being uninformative to a lot of what you actually judge in terms of direct policy matters.
Right.
So, yeah.
Go ahead, Cal.
I was just going to ask you, Nate, again, trying to make sense out of your reaction, and I don't say that negatively, but, trying to make more sense of your reaction to sort of poses and standpoints and gripes and grousing from the comment sections and on streams and TLC. To what do you ascribe the discontent that would make an otherwise reasonable liberal person sort of resort to these, what do you said, like the Italian theorists, and what do you think drives that? I mean, if you could, if you could do your best to sort of play devil's advocate with those guys, and they tend, what do you think is driving that?
I think that it depends on who we're talking about. Like, so when Paul is talking about it, I think it's curiosity, because I think Paul likes to explore whatever's going on. He wants to explore it and find out what it's about because of his curiosity, right? So when Paul's talking about it, it's like he knows it's out there and he wants to find out about it. And it's for the same reason that I read the books that the post-liberals read, right? It's like, I don't agree with them, but I read their books.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right.
Yeah, no,
so it's like,
I guess I'm not worried about Paul. I mean, look, Paul's
exactly.
not a proto-fascist.
Right. So in the case of Paul, exactly. Paul is obviously solidly a liberal. There's no question about it. Yeah. And in the case of the younger crowd, it's like, I think I can't blame them because they don't really have much experience living in a healthy liberal culture
but what experience do they have, right? I guess that's kind of what
the
I think it's important to lean into their experience.
It's really hard for them to separate liberalism from
the shit show that we live in.
Progressivism that just went completely amok.
Right.
In fact, that's
and I think that's just really important.
That article that I tried to write.
Yeah.
And also
I actually
could use examples.
Comments, Kale, like, show me a liberalism that doesn't allow for gay pride parades in the city center, and I might get behind it, right? So it's clear that it's like they can't separate the progressive agenda that they've been it's been force fed them their entire life,
fire hose,
in the school system.
Right.
They cannot separate that from liberalism, and I do not blame them for feeling
absolutely how we killed classical liberalism. That's exactly what the point of
what I'm trying to show them is that, hey, you guys, liberalism doesn't have to be like that, and you don't. It doesn't give order. It doesn't give a space
to defend that classical liberalism, because it sounds like to people that you're defending all the rest of it.
Yeah,
I'm not.
No,
I know you're not. What I mean is generally
Jim is trying to get at.
I don't know. I think I don't know. I think people know that I'm not defending that stuff.
No,
I'm pretty clear where I stand.
I'm not pointing to you, Nate. I'm pointing to the general vibe.
Well,
yeah.
About what you just said, though. So one, I'm from this generation, so I can give an insight in that direction. But what you said about the school system, okay, so what is the classical liberal school system of the classical liberalism that you want? I don't think there is one in terms of the curriculum, right? Okay, you read the Constitution over and over and over and over and over again. Well, are you going to interpret it? Well, according to what philosophy you're going to interpret it. That's just not the kind of thing that fits with a liberal state that's trying to fund something that recommends impartially. That's why, school vouchers is another whole kind of debate. What could you have a system like that or not? And there's a debate over whether in a school voucher system you could say your school can't be segregated, and there's things like that, right? But it's impossible to set up a system like that. But then the other thing I'll say is,
go ahead.
Well, go ahead, Jim.
Real quick, the only thing I disagree with you on that is that it's impossible to set up a system, because I think that all these definitions will always be vague. So there's always going to be contestation in politics, in the best sense of politics, where these things are debated and worked out, and the lines are always going to be vague. And even all the way down to in the school, it's going to be vague. And you develop and evolve, and you do things like vouchers. You give people options. You go too far in one direction, you get pushed back and you go back in the other direction. And so it's possible that there could be a more or an ethos that would be classically liberal without necessarily undoing the possibilities of this.
I mean,
to be actually expressed through the politics.
It strikes me that I think it's important, at least the way that I see it. I'm going to insert this, see what y'all think of it. You know, that liberalism is a kind of an achievement, right? It's a jig, right? It guides the saws, it guides the tools, right? It does all these sorts of things, and so, therefore, it has rendered a kind of story, and that story, more so than theory, more so than policy or anything like, it has rendered a story that has exposed itself to be a lie. And so I think that yet young people in particular, and you know, I'm very young people these days, you know, young people in particular are exposed to the lies of the narrative in ways that people older than me don't feel or see or experience.
Well, they're not even exposed to something that's actually liberalism, because it's, you're not, I mean, the minute the schools begin taking on the task of deliberately indoctrinating people into a particular worldview, you're not in liberalism anymore.
Right.
But that's always the case, right, Nate?
Yeah.
I mean, there's always a story that's being delivered.
Yeah.
It's just
liberalism
was really good at hiding it, right? I mean,
yeah, but the thing is that, like, ultimately, but the thing is that story is like too much one note, which is why I think the school choice thing is very important, Marcus, for that reason. And I really think that it should be the norm. It should be the norm that education in this country is religious education. That should be the norm.
Well, but that just makes you a Nazi.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, I'm being
well,
right,
you know, it depends if it wouldn't be public schooling, obviously, Nate, if it was primarily religious education, right?
Right.
Yeah. So in the United States, the largest wave of increase in public schooling was towards the end of the 19th century, when there was a fear about, you know, popery and whatever, you know, and the idea that, okay, well, we have some culture over in the clouds over us that's preserving our liberalism. We don't know exactly what needs to be in that culture for it to keep us in liberalism. We think it has something to do with being a Protestant white American or something like that, right? So with all these Catholics in here, this is a liability. This is potentially going to destroy our culture. So we now need to step outside of our liberal bounds to re-educate these people into something else. I mean, there's a backlash, and that's why you get the system of Catholic schools that develop in large part. But yeah,
that's an interesting story too. You know, American Catholicism is very unique in that regard, because I think it was Bishop Carroll in like 1870, thereabouts, basically mandated that if you were Catholic, you had to send your kids to Catholic schools. Right. There was where I'm
going to be teaching at Eastern University outside of Philly is right next to Archbishop John Carroll High School.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So you know, so perhaps American public school systems were consciously, unconsciously created as a kind of reaction in an interesting way against this sort of very highly organized Catholic school system in America. That's an interesting element. I hadn't thought about that.
That is interesting.
Yeah,
I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in case there's some people that want to join us at this point. Since we've been talking for an hour solo, I don't want to block the rest of TLC out of the conversation. So
I feel like I'm in the line of fire here, Nate. This is going to be tough, man.
So
there was something else I wanted to say about Catholic schools, but I'm forgetting it now. So I'll tell you if it comes back to me.
Well, yeah,
I just dropped the link, Luke.
You know, public schools are very much American schools, which means they're very much, at least back in the day, Protestant schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was that's the, you know, and when did that stop? Like, when did that consciously or unconsciously stop being the case?
Okay, well, one thing to say is that, okay, so if originally public schools were a Protestant idea to, well, basically what it does is when you create the public school system, you didn't just create a permanent preservative of the Protestant culture that was supposedly preserving liberalism, but you now just create a battlefield over which people who are supposedly enculturated in a liberal culture, and maybe people that aren't enculturated in a liberal culture, end up just fighting over what the next generation is going to believe, whether or not it helps liberalism or not. So what you really subject the people to is not some indoctrination, but what you subject them to is a new battleground over which culture is going to happen, in which you can actually use the tools of the government against people on the other cultural side.
Right. And as I think Nate intuits, this is always ultimately a fight about the future, right? Because you can stick 30 40-year-olds in a room under sort of the liberal rules of order, and we can sort of establish a kind of a method of sort of working out a polity. The problem is young people and old people. Right, that it's the pressures that were placed upon what exactly am I passing on, and of course you do a deep dive into this as soon as you have your own child, right? You're like, oh crap, like I was fine, all of a sudden now I have to worry about time in a way that I did not have to worry about, and I do think that that's where liberalism struggles, is that sort of intergenerational into the future.
I won that game. My son who's turning 25 today. Today is his 25th birthday. 4th of July, baby. 4th of July.
Oh, it's my mom's birthday. You just reminded me.
He was very much for a while trending toward a kind of reactionary conservatism and a hyper reform theology.
Right.
And now he is solidly Anglo-Catholic and libertarian.
Yeah.
So
cool. Yeah.
I would just say that this is just a feeling that I have about Cale and Marcus talking, but again, I feel like that I'm in this kind of prior generation. In the statement that I would make, and is in this article I think that I wrote, is that if we can't disambiguate through the culture and all the places that Marcos was talking about, all the way down into the school and in the various domains of our culture, if we can't, kind of disambiguate the principled liberalism from the progressive liberalism, if ultimately we think classical liberalism actually was the ideological origin of progressive liberalism, if we think that's true, then there's no way to defend classical liberalism anymore. And so that would mean we're beyond it. Now, I don't know what would come after it, but if we can't disambiguate those two things, then we can't defend it.
Right, and that's Keller's, I think, very helpful, programmatic versus procedural liberalism, right? And the question is, can you have procedural without the programmatic?
Right.
I think one of the things that the post-liberals have fixated on, with a laser beam, is precisely the sort of the ways in which programmatic liberalism masked itself and masks itself as a procedure. And that's
what I meant by saying this is what killed it, because if you ultimately let that happen too much, you can't disambiguate anymore and you can't defend it. And that's what I was trying to say with Nate in my conversation before, is that I'm a reactionary liberal in the sense that I see myself live in a world that's probably moved past it. And therefore, in my defense of it, which I still hold on to, I recognize that I'm on the edge. I'm becoming less central to the conversation.
Well, there's an elegy.
It may not ultimately be defensible.
Yeah, there's an elegiac quality to that, isn't there,
Exactly.
Jim? Yeah.
And so a lot of practical, like, liberal theorizing or liberal political theory is trying to figure out how can we make sure that these procedures are insulated from programmatic attacks, right? So sheer democracy, if we vote, like all 330 million citizens vote on something, there's a sense of procedure to that. I know if you win the election, you get your policy, and that's pretty clear, unbiased opinion. But it's so subject to momentary cultural changes, and it's very unclear what direction the path is actually going to go. So the way that Hayek articulates something like that is you can't actually have freedom in a society like that, because you can't know over what domain you can act. You don't have your little plot of land over which you can make actions that are going to affect tomorrow. So there's no sense of freedom. Actually requires some sort of stability. So even though there's a proceduralism to democracy, it can be overridden by parties that have a program that they want to implement on everything, right? So liberal political theory is about thinking, over what domains can I have the government act such that we can maintain and govern this with procedure so it doesn't go amok. And it's not going to be everything. So that's the sense in which you have to police yourself culturally to make sure you don't use the necessary illiberal, wheels and bells and whistles of your government for ultimately illiberal means to destroy the whole system. So that you're going to have a military, right? And the military is going to be programmatic. That's how militaries work. There's procedure, of course, but they have missions. How do we pick those missions? It's going to be by whatever the Senate votes on. Hopefully, not by just whatever the president decides today. Right, right. So once you have a military where it's just the president could just point anywhere around the world and they go and do that, then liberalism is lost with respect to your foreign policy.
So I wanted to highlight this comment from Monsieur Lefebvre here. He says that the procedural tyranny, which comes from propositional tyranny, so it's like the procedural tyranny comes out of the propositional tyranny. I think I want to share an anecdote for something that happened to me. At one point, I worked for the state of Washington, and at one point, I was voluntold to be on a DEI panel, and in one of the meetings for this DEI panel that I was voluntold to be on, I pointed out the way in which the entire DEI program was. They asked the question as to why people react against it and what was causing the resistance to it. And so I gave them the true answer that they didn't want to hear, which is that it's actually the propositional tyranny of DEI that makes it rotten. And I suggested that if you wanted to do DEI, the right way to do it is through participation, by actually having people share foods of their culture, share music of their culture, share dances of their culture, share traditions of their culture, and to actually engage in this kind of like participatory cross-cultural exchange. That's how you do DEI correctly. That's how we actually learn from each other.
I would say what we need to,
just to present a propositional program that is designed to do nothing other than flip the existing hierarchies, so that you shift power in another direction where you think it should go, does nothing to encourage diversity whatsoever.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, what I would want to happen is that it would be recognized that DEI as a general concept is an ideology, and that ideology should not be supported one way or the other. It shouldn't be affirmed or supported by the institutionalization of our government, and that we would notice that we shouldn't be doing that. We can give it to the non-governmental world to work out, and there might be people out there who want to support that, and they can do that, but it shouldn't be part of the classical liberal principles that run our government. Right. Now, I know Marcus is going to come back and say, you can't draw those lines. Those lines are not possible to draw, but all lines are vague. So it's a contestation and it's a conversation. And my experience with DEI, Nate, is that on the one hand, it's very broadly made itself into the culture. Yeah. I think it is receding, but it's very thin.
It's not receding.
Everybody. I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, but my experience with needing to go through videos about DEI within the institutions that I've worked in is that they're all lame, and everyone knows they're lame, and they don't really have much effect.
But Jim, it's like propaganda. Propaganda,
is propaganda.
As Lula would say, propaganda is not, or Lewis or whoever, pick your guy. That propaganda is not meant to convince anybody of anything. It's meant to show that you can say these crazy things and get away with it, right? It's like it's a power flex. It's not a hearts and minds thing. It really is not.
And it's the evidence of what I'm talking about before, which is that the ideologies have worked themselves so intertwined into the interstices of what we think of as liberalism, it's going to be maybe impossible to tear them apart.
Yeah, and that's probably why I have no faith in it too. You're coming at it from a kind of an elegiac standpoint, like, man, it was a great thing. It really worked for a long time. Whereas I guess maybe this is a function of my own generation and the own sort of the crunches that I feel and the pulls that I feel being caught in between all this, is that it's not working and we're engaged in this sort of strange pretend, and I get frustrated, again with like the sort of the conservative side of liberalism, where they just don't want to face up to the contradictions and the tensions inherent that our kids, and especially, and maybe this is inflammatory, our boys in particular, are really feeling.
Yeah, you and I, Cale, I think are relatively close, except I'm staying in the old world.
Well,
Jim,
I actually think I'm more stubborn. I think I'm even more stubborn than you, because Bruno de Bergerac is my spirit animal, and a man does not fight to win. You stand up for what's right because it's right.
Right.
Even if no one else can see it, even if it's gotten spoiled, if it's right, you stand up for it. Period.
Yeah, it's Gavin
and
Stevens.
I don't care if it's a losing battle. I'm going to fight it anyway.
Yeah, but that's, and I get where you're coming from. That is, I think, a solidly Christian position, Nate. I mean, it's the position of the knight, right? That there's a great line in Faulkner's Snopes trilogy, and Gavin Stevens or Ratcliffe, one of them, says something to the effect of, like, you need to defend honor and virtue in a woman, whether it exists or not, which is a kind of a riff on what you're talking about. Like, you need to fight for what's right, whether you're going to win or lose. It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
it's interesting to have, with this. Well, I want
to tell you how my DEI story ended. So here's the thing. So after I said that, the head of the panel said, "You're right." She acknowledged that I was right, and then she said, "But the curriculum we have is the curriculum we have."
Right. Proceed. So again, notice the way
it
then proceeds into proceduralism. Right.
There's one more thing.
Oh, my hands are tied.
Yeah.
I was conveniently removed from that panel.
Of course. Yeah.
Allegedly because my workload was too heavy and I didn't need the extra responsibility.
Yeah.
But it was immediately after that I was removed from the panel.
Yeah.
Well, so draw your own conclusions.
Yeah. Well, I had the opposite. You sounds like you lived through a much more gracious procedure than I lived through, which was I got struggle sessioned, and then I got multiple calls for me being fired and removed from my position. So,
Well, Cale, I'm very adept at talking about things in a language that the people that I'm talking to will understand. So it's like I didn't just in your face say everything you're doing is wrong, diversity and equity are bad. What I said was, if you actually care about diversity, this is the way you would go about it.
Nate, I was very winsome and charming and
oh, really?
lovely in my meetings.
Oh boy,
they read my Twitter feed.
Oh yeah, you're screwed then. Yeah.
Well, so I'll say one thing though about all these situations is there's a sense of procedural tyranny or propositional tyranny, but in many cases it's actually that some set of procedures is abandoned or stepped outside of, and then another set of procedures or propositions or non-procedures or propositions just flows in that were not expected or were not anticipated, and they only come in because those initial procedures are moved away from. So something like Title IX in schools that have public funding, the law which sets up the Title IX all the Title IX offices is extremely brief. It's a title. It's not the whole law. Right. It's literally something like there should be equality between the genders in public school education or in schools funded by the federal government or something like that. It's almost like a sentence or two, and that sentence or two supposedly justifies that all of these large offices are mandated to be run by all of these other people who are alleged experts on these various issues, just to enforce this very abstract law, which we don't know what it means in all of these cases. So in a sense, it's Congress's sort of dereliction of duty to actually be developing laws which help aid the liberal society, such that people are subject now to these experts or supposed experts on these various things, and then the combat comes over who gets to be the expert and who gets to do this or that or the other
instead of actual legislation. Yeah.
Here's a bit of a question for Cale that I would throw out. In one way, in a kind of abstract and ideal sense, a classical liberal state depends on the cultural soundness of the communities that it is supposedly giving space to exist. And the kind of complementary or dialectical way we could talk about the failure of liberal the liberal order is actually the failure of those institutions to hold themselves together. So if you take something like, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes here, but if you take something like gay marriage, you move from it, the government just takes over the sanctification of the union, and you say, well, that's terrible, the government's doing that. But what about the institutions that were supposed to be holding on to that sanctification for themselves? Why did they just let it slip away? And if they had authority within the culture, they could have exercised that authority and held on to that sanctification. And that could be written broader in terms of the failures of various denominations of Christianity, and maybe even the Catholic Church. And the ground was set at the beginning of the nation to say, hey, look, you Puritans, you can go over there and you can be Puritans. And they needed to stay. Those institutions needed to keep their integrity within the culture. And it wasn't all external forces that kind of undermined that. It was the gradual deterioration of those institutions themselves.
And the reason why those institutions were seated is unclear. And it's probably different in every case. Sometimes it's because of the government displacing them, or what we call crowding them out, or something like that. But sometimes it's because they failed in their internal function. Right. Such that they were impotent to basically answer those questions in some collection.
Yeah, you can, and Marcus, you probably have a good handle on this. The kind of community organizations that were part of the 19th century that Tocqueville talks about, not just religious ones.
Yes.
Those were a big part of the American, the Elks Club. My grandfather was part of these kinds of organizations that were the teams, not the Teamsters, but those kinds of organizations were a big part of cultural continuity, cohesion.
Yeah. And those organizations did things in the community.
Yeah.
They weren't just social clubs only. Right. They actually they actively did things in the community. These kinds of organizations and churches are so much better at doing the things that government now has taken over.
Yeah, the social safety net. Right. I mean, this is the classic conservative argument against government expansion, right? Is that these eventually crowd out those local subsidiary. It's sort of a subsidiary model. The town of Bristol, here in Rhode Island, has 25 different organizations which help widows of firemen. And
I don't think conservative liberals can agree with post liberals about the need for subsidiarity. Like, there's no argument about that.
Yeah, and then I could step back in and say something like, hey, I'm all in support of exclusionary organizations like the Catholic Church becoming more healthy and a more prominent part of our culture.
But that became untenable in the 90s.
I think that would be a good thing.
But that became untenable in the 90s when, Catholic Charities had to shut down their adoption services in Massachusetts and then everywhere else because they were unable to offer child placement into unmarried or gay couples.
Right.
And so
again, just reiterating the same problem again of the ideology getting itself into the.
In my career in public disclosure, I spent some time working for the Economic Services Administration of DSHS, so I could see. So I wasn't actually like a caseworker or anything. I was in public disclosure, but I still dealt with the records.
Right.
And I could see what was going on in the social service agencies from the inside. And the problem with them, it's like, I mean, honestly, and I know how you feel about UBI. But I honestly think just like gutting those programs entirely altogether and just replacing them with UBI would be a very good thing, because those agencies are so inherent. And it's not because I don't care about the people that they're serving. I actually do care. Yeah. The problem is those agencies are inherently dehumanizing in the way, and also they give terrible incentives.
Oh yeah,
they're set up with completely anti-family incentives.
Right, that's right.
That encourage the worst kinds of behavior.
Yeah.
And if not UBI, then I would like to see like the space open up for subsidiary institutions to step back into that picture, where you could actually do that thing with a humanizing face on it, instead of the inhuman results that we get handling it through a government agency, which is just like it lowers the human dignity of both the bureaucrats who are working in the institution and the people the institution services. For real, it's really awful.
So UBI is actually the policy that Hayek kind of briefly supports in The Road to Serfdom. He says this one is actually reasonable because it's fixed, clear, we can debate over the degree of it, and it has relatively low market distortions as opposed to others. And it's a welfare policy which is more amenable to liberal norms because it doesn't have all of these bureaucrats that need to be making on-the-spot decisions according to the means by which, or the ideology which guides those decisions, is then something that comes from outside liberalism that you then feel the need to police and grow your influence in the government to control your basic life, right? But I pulled out The Wealth of Nations because it's actually in here. Smith he's talking about why the poor laws exist, and he very briefly says it. He says, well, the poor laws were passed under Elizabeth because all the monasteries used to do all of the poor
all the work.
And then Henry got rid of all of them. So eventually, so you just had all these poor people walking around, and then they needed to pass these poor laws. And then he says, and then people passed these poor laws, and different local, if I'm remembering correctly, different local parishes were required to actually give welfare. And then you had a problem of poor people moving to the parishes, which would give them the most poor relief.
Of course, right.
And then so then they pass another set of laws, the Settlement Acts, which restrict people from moving. So people have to stay in one spot. And so the main point of his section, and then he starts complaining about the Settlement Acts, and he goes, and then this prevents labor mobility. It prevents our ability to industrialize. So it's wrong on like 5 different angles, right? But there was an organic part of the society that was providing that function that when ripped out, you need to add some sort of prosthetic limb, right? That is inconvenient in all sorts of other ways.
The long march of secularization is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
I have dropped the link if anybody wants to get it. The stream is now open if anybody wants to come in and talk to us.
I guess they don't like us, Nate. I guess they don't like us. Right?
Or they agree with us.
Yeah. Right. We batted 1,000 today. You know. It's like, so if nobody, I would love to pick your brains about the whole UBI thing, you know, and the AI apocalypse and all that kind of stuff. You know, it's like, I hear what you're saying, you know, Hayek, or you know, Nate, you were talking about UBI as like, actually, it might make the most sense. It's much better than a sort of government bureaucracy. I'm just sort of wondering what you all think will happen to us spiritually if we come to a position in our polity and political economy that nobody can actually scratch out a living, and we're all just, I mean, how is that not serfdom?
Well, I haven't thought about UBI so much. I'm not per se for it, but all I'm saying is there is a way of thinking about certain kinds of policies, even like welfare policies, which do more or less interrupt the rest of the liberal norms of our society. Right. And UBI, and so that's why Hayek says it. He's like, welfare policy is a huge gaping hole that you can potentially throw the well-being of your society into. Let's have one that's like at least a strict rule that we can measure and know what's going on. Right. But the other kinds of effects that you talk about, still, it obviously has distortionary effects on someone's willingness to build up their own life in various ways. Right. Yeah.
Well, I think, but you know, like,
and I'm asking the question, Nate. I'm actually asking the question. I'm not.
I think, yeah, sure. I think here's what I think about it. I think it's better than the social safety. I think that UBI is preferable to the existing social safety nets that we have. Revitalizing subsidiary institutions and using the church, at least, even if it were going to be distributing federal funds through the church, and kind of like, or through churches, like allowing private institutions that can actually like deal with people in a more personal, less bureaucratic way, to actually like figure out like, okay, what are the challenges that is keeping this family in poverty, and how can we address those problems? that would be better than UBI in an ideal world. However, I think UBI is something that we have to be on the table because we're looking at a future where potentially, like, the vast majority of people are going to be unemployable in the labor market.
Right. Yeah.
And so people have to live. And I don't, if someone has an alternative to UBI, I'm open to hearing it, but UBI looks like the best option.
Right.
I also think that UBI, although not the ideal solution, might be easier to implement the kind of return of distribution through subsidiary institutions that I'm talking about. That's probably less politically viable than just like gutting the social safety net in favor of UBI. That's probably more politically viable. But not necessarily the ideal solution. So
what does that do to our kids? And again, I'm not fighting here, Nate. I'm just I'm thinking out loud. I mean, like, what does it do to our kids? And like, my daughter's in theory going to college in the fall, and like, why? Like, what? Like,
right?
Now, you know me. I'm an educational romantic. Like, I want my kids to study Aristotle and Plato and Dante and Dostoevsky and and all of that. But we know that that's not really what college is largely for, right? It's a credentialing scam, all right, in order to prepare kids for bullshit email jobs, right? And so so what do we do with our kids in the specter of UBI? And I mean like spiritually, what I mean? Like,
I mean, right. So I think this is what I started to transition this even before talking about UBI, because there's this. First of all, I think anyone who's being honest has to admit that liberalism is completely dependent upon having a relatively educated, relatively virtuous population,
right,
to work, and needs to have both of those things. And so the hope is that if our kids have been given a good education and a good set of virtues and values, that what they will choose to do will be something that is productive, whether or not, like, it may not be something that the economy will reward,
right,
but it's still something that is humanly valuable and productive. So rather than like just sit at home and play video games all day, and there are going to be people. You're going to have people that choose to subsist on their UBI and stay home and play video games all day. I don't think there's no way of avoiding that. I'm not going to pretend that that's not going to be the outcome for some, but I don't think it follows that it's necessarily the universal outcome.
Okay.
My thought on this is I wouldn't be educated enough or knowledgeable enough to talk about whether UBI would necessarily be better than what we have now. I probably would be, Nate. I'd probably agree with you on that. We do have a version of that, however, which is perhaps very unpleasant to think about. But people get SSI, they get funding through welfare, they get Medicaid, they get so there is a kind of bottom that ends up probably being something like a UBI in the end.
Right, of course,
to be labeled with all this,
it's not a ticket for flourishing, is it, Jim?
Yeah, no, right. That would be the problem with it, is that in order to get it, you have to be labeled dysfunctional. You have to
be and it's not UBI because it's not universal. It go like that. The thing with UBI is universal. It goes to everyone. It's not means tested.
I understand. It goes to everyone. Although approximate universal. I mean, if you end up getting ill, you're a middle-aged person, young person. You're not yet qualified for Medicare and your Medicaid or your Social Security, you will ultimately get supported in your dysfunction by your appeal to SSI or whatever the other forms of government support are that you would qualify for. So no, I agree with you that it would probably be more sensible to do it in that way. But ultimately,
in the 80s, there was a huge movement to simplify the tax code, right?
Yeah.
and to get rid of all of these additional special things. In a sense, that is very illiberal in the sense that a lot of those kinds of tax breaks show up because individual congressmen are trying to get a tax break for a special industry in their constituency, in which they'll get a lot of electoral support, and you can't rally enough electoral support elsewhere that's going to oppose it because it's just a minor tax break for one small thing, such that all of those things pile up, and there's all this confusing tax system. Simplifying it makes it much liberal, and then committing, well, in some sense, trying to commit to keeping that tax code relatively simple as a way of preserving liberal norms about how we make decisions about these tax things. This is, in a sense, the welfare equivalent of something like that. Simplifying the transfer code in something.
And my simple point was going to be that there's going to be casualties within the culture, no matter what system you choose. And so ultimately, I think that we need to have a healthy political system that allows us to work these things out. And ultimately, and in my personal opinion, the bias should be towards, people being advantaged for their own effort and their own participation. And that has to be part of the bias of it, even though with that bias, we would expect to see some version of casualties within various populations. And we have to try to work our way through that and live with that. And universal basic income might be the right way to do it, although I think it's politically not in the cards.
Just Marcus,
the way to do it if it comes with repealing a lot of other policies.
Right.
That's the part.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I would want to see I would want to see it replace all the existing social safety net programs entirely.
Right.
It's interesting that you brought up the flat tax idea from the 80s, because I was a huge Jack Kemp supporter. Like that was like that. He was my guy. I was all on board for that. So a little bit of nostalgia for me.
Well, I want to jump in. I want to find out, Dr. Jim, because it's good to see you again. By the way, it's been too long. We need another convivium so we can all
in Arkansas.
We need another. Yeah, we need another one of those.
Yep.
I saw your talk with Sam Tiedemann there.
Yep.
I'm sorry, man. I was sorely disappointed. I was really surprised. But I like your point here is, to me, is the core point. If there's a thing called classical liberalism that the kids will say need to be made aware of, so they don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is, I think, what you're all basically saying to some extent. I think the core problem is no one has defined that, and I can define it pretty easily, actually, which is weird that I haven't ever heard anybody else define it at all. So can you do that? Or, I mean, we can roll with my definition if you want and kind of refine it, because it's rough for sure. But it's like, can you do the differentiation between those two things? Because that seems to be the core issue. Like, can we differentiate we'll say a good liberalism from a bad liberalism or something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I could. And as I've already said, I think these definitions are ultimately, doomed to be vague. And so there's not going to be some sort of strict, kind of propositional based setup here. But ultimately, a philosophy that, of restraint, of governmental restraint, that is married with a kind of institutional strength of that governmental organization that is ready to step in and protect people's individual, and I mean individual here, not as individual person, although that would be part of it, but individual communities' right to express themselves within the culture in ways that are that are open to their own expressions of their will and their agency and their desires and their cultural understanding, and that they could do that with the constraint placed on them that they don't impose that on others in that same commons of free action, and that would be married with a principle of property rights and married also with a confidence that the government was going to restrain itself from participating in the promotion of ideology, which of course would also include religious ideology, but as we've already talked about, would include things that go beyond religious ideology. and that would be the kind of the base case. And Marcus would probably be better at fleshing this out a little bit further, but that would be this ideal that would be strived for. And I think it is reasonably instantiated in the Constitution married with the Bill of Rights.
Well, yeah, you're basically describing the federal government in the United States,
and
which is kind of fair, except my pushback would be constraints on what, because the problem with saying liberalism and starting there is it's a middle out term that starts from an individualist perspective, right, and identifies against everything else, technically. Right. The interesting thing about putting the modifier in the language of classical in front of liberalism is there's a bunch of implications there. And if we tie it back, because I think we'll see your intuition here is correct. If we tie it back to, we'll say, the modern conception, and I'm working on my live stream for tonight on What is a Nation. So I've already done some of this research this morning. If we tie it back to the United States, because that's where this comes from, right? And you could say, well, the United States conception comes from the Enlightenment, and then you go, no, the Scottish Enlightenment, very different, right? But we could go back and forth in details all day long. But the conception of the classics comes from Rome, Greece, and Jerusalem. It comes from the revivification, because you have to buy into the Dark Ages. Because otherwise, using the term enlightenment actually doesn't make any sense. The Dark Ages are dark because effectively no one had access to the classics. They didn't have what we would call classical literature, as in the old stuff, not we'll say Dickens. Although I would lump Dickens in. I would say, look, there's a Western canon.
Yeah. So Lewis says the same thing, Mark. Yeah. Lewis talks about basically from antiquity all the way up until Milton.
I would say there's also. I think that's good to point out to the classical part of classical liberalism too. But I also think we need to point out to there's also a way in which it's important to understand that the basic assumption that liberalism makes, that is, say, different from what post-liberals makes. Post-liberals believe that you can use government to point toward the good collectively. Liberalism assumes that government is at best a necessary evil. So we can't do without it.
Let me push back on Mark,
Go ahead.
if I could. And I'll start with the Protestant Reformation. Protestantism is not a first century religion. It is a 16th century religion. Mm-hmm. And so too, the Enlightenment and the subsequent events that led to the United States Constitution, those are 16th and 17th and 18th century conceptualizations of the world. Okay. Yep. So going back to, not pretending, but indicating that they had some sort of sense of roots that go deep into history is, it's true in at least their own self-conception of what they were doing, but what they were doing was embedded in their own context. And my personal opinion about this is that this was a consequence of the kind of fatigue and end point of the religious wars of the 16th century that ultimately placed a demand on people, at least at the elite level, of somehow responding to that. And so, that's simplistic. I know that's high school.
I think you're both right. Because Mark is still right. Because if you look at the Protestant Reformation, yes, it's a 16th century movement. But in order to bolster its case against Rome, it's looking backwards. There's always been a restorationist element to Protestantism.
It's looking backward is embedded in its current context.
Right. But Navigating Patterns is a wonderful playlist on history. And so one of the threads in that playlist, one of the themes that I'm trying to get people to understand is that effectively what happens is we have kingship everywhere. It's a wonderful thing. It actually works great, contrary to popular belief. And then we behead the English king. That begets the French Revolution. And the reason why the French Revolution comes from that is actually because of the success of the United States. And so the United States is this unique, weird thing that actually nobody has any explanation for. Like contemporaneously or today, nobody has any explanation for how this came to be. Because, and this is, again, from my research this morning, just 2 hours ago or so, that we corrupt the word nation. Like the word nation means something very specific until the United States comes along. And then I think it's in like maybe the early 1900s, maybe it's the 1800s, I forget, right? We corrupted it by our success effectively in our two-tier government. But the thing that drives the Puritan nation or the Protestant nation, if you want to put it that way, it's really a Puritan nation for the first 75 years, by the way, but is the beheading of the king and the betrayal of the subsequent king against his own colonies. And then the unique thing and the difference between, we'll say, the American Revolution and the French Revolution is the following. The American Revolution said, we can't do without a king and a hierarchy. We need to replace it. And the French Revolution said, hey, look at the Americans. They just did away with all this stuff. So we can too. And that hasn't worked, right? And it's taking a long time to see that it hasn't worked. I agree. But as France has probably the most momentum of any organized country in the world.
The one missing historical piece you have in that story, though, is the Glorious Revolution, which is where the English people don't behead their king, but they say, we still do have rights here. We are allowed to declare if you are no longer our king collectively as a parliament, but then they invite in another king as part of that, right? So they don't do away with their version of the executive branch. They don't do away with their version of the government. Right,
Marcus. And that's all well and good. Like everything's fine, right? Until the most important thing happens. The most important thing is that the East India Company, which is the largest corporation that has ever existed, I think it's larger than the 10 largest corporations today.
Oh, yeah.
Takes over the English government through Parliament with the help of Cromwell, right? Like that changes the world. And then because the Puritans ran this experiment, ran the 13 colonies, right? They just rolled over the Quakers, man. You got to read about what happens when they go into Philadelphia. Philadelphia is governed by the people there until they roll into Philadelphia, the revolutionaries basically, and say, no, we're going to put the seat of government here. By the way, you ain't running the place no more. And that now the Quakers no longer have control of their own territory. And then ultimately we move to DC. But it is the force of the corporate takeover of a government, which might be the first one in history, at least it's the first one of a major government that I know of in history. Right? That's what causes all of this to happen. And I think the US worked only because A, they replaced the king. B, they said, without God, this experiment, they knew it was an experiment, doesn't work. Right? And they had the Scottish Enlightenment in particular to inform their ideas about these things that had been taken for granted, we'll say, throughout the Middle Ages. Right? We'll say with the momentum of the Middle Ages and the system they had in place, no one needed to think about those things. That might be why we lost the texts. There might be other reasons. It doesn't really matter. They were found, if you will, and then taken up by these people who founded the nation. That's all over the Federalist Papers, by the way, right? And then those concepts are used specifically within the context of God and a common idea of God. I believe that's in there too, if my memory's correct. And to form a government with all of these, we'll say original pieces that the Protestants had lost because they're Protestants and not Catholics. Catholics had them all along, right? And that's what allows them to replace the king. So we still got God. We've got to replace the king in the hierarchy. We do that with effectively the federal government. And all the federal government does, people don't realize this if you actually read the Constitution carefully enough, it's a bunch of constraints on government. And it's no constraints on persons. None. Those aren't there. All the constraints on persons come at the local level, right? And the only constraints on those constraints are outlined in the Constitution. In other words, governments can't do X, Y, and Z to their people. Most of the Constitution only applies to the federal level of governance. It doesn't apply to what states can do. So, for example, Maryland, that's supposed to be a Catholic state with a Catholic religion, because nothing bars a state from having a state religion in the United States. Nothing. right? And people don't know that. But once you kind of understand what actually happened, and then the French try to copy it, although they see it poorly, right? And nobody, it's 25 years after we've successfully gotten away from England, and the spies in France and England are still writing back. Any day now, this whole thing's going to collapse, and you'll be able to move your troops in. I've seen the letters; they're amazing. And of course, for some reason, we survive. And then everybody looks at that, and what happens is they take up the French idea of liberté, which is completely undefined, and that's where liberalism comes from. But this country is founded on classical liberalism, and no one else has even tried it, as near as I can tell. And part of that is because, as Marcus pointed out, the
Mark,
Magna Carta in particular, and the idea of self-governance we got from England, not from the continent.
Mark, I completely agree with you. This is why I keep saying it's like Americanism is different, and if we want to preserve it because it is extraordinary.
Right, but it's all the identification against and the rebellion that's caused the destruction of all the things that made it work. And it's that constant rebellion and abuse of the system. Well, if you really want to peg it down, it would probably be FDR. Right. And then since then, we've been on the FDR train of more government or federal government power.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Mark, let me try and offer a little bit more of a definition like you asked for earlier. And like I mentioned earlier, my definition of this stuff comes mostly from Dan Klein, who was one of my main mentors at George Mason. And he's working very, very distinctly out of Adam Smith, right? Or what Adam Smith calls basically the liberal plan, right? He doesn't use, he doesn't say I'm a classical liberal, obviously, but what he called the liberal plan is essentially his view of what a good government would do. And he's thinking of it in terms of economics, but he's also thinking of it in these broader philosophical purposes of a government ideas too. And so at one level, you can define commutative justice, or what he calls commutative justice, or what people like Grotius called justitia expletrix, or the very clear sort of lines of mine, yours, property, right, things like that. I'm not allowed to punch you in the face. You're not allowed to steal my wallet and things like that, right? Now, sometimes though we have, and so me respecting your stuff and you respecting my stuff, we can call that security, right? And it's very hard to sustain security just by a bunch of guys sitting in their houses, because as soon as one person gets a gun, it's very hard to motivate him to stick to that standard of justice, right? As long as there's enough people with enough capacity to get together and do something like that, you run into this problem of people's property rights being insecure. So in almost every system, you have a government. Where we get the government from is different in every single case, whether it's voluntarily decided upon by the group or whether it was an invader that came in and sat on top of all of you, right? But often we have this thing called the government that takes on the responsibility in many cases of making sure that people's property is still respected. The government then, if the government has the capacity to protect your property, they then have the capacity to violate it in almost every case. If they've monopolized violence in some way, right? So then there's another analogous relationship perhaps between the government, however it's governed, whether it's a group of elites or whether it's a group of elected officials, the government and respecting your property, which we call taxes usually. Well, how much taxes they have or how much they go in to regulate what you can do with your own property. That relationship we call liberty. Right? The government respecting your stuff, we can call that liberty. So the government generally restraining from influencing or violating your property in various ways, we can call that, or us trying to hold to a principle of that, or maybe a general maxim of that, is what we'd call the liberal plan generally. Such that the government then, so it's basically I have a somewhat similar definition to Jim's, but I'm trying to simplify it and define it in these already existing terms where there are clear rules. Because which are generally the rules of property rights. Now there are going to be exceptions to that because you need taxes to fund the government, or there may be certain exceptions in which we wouldn't want a free market to operate, or you need a military to defend yourself against foreign invaders and things like that.
Or you need eminent domain.
Yes. So there are going to be some exceptions, and those exceptions are going to be how we govern those exceptions are going to be difficult. So we want to minimize those as much as possible so that we can maintain
and we
the
need a healthy politics.
Yes.
Whatever that means, to argue these things out and set those lines. When is eminent domain okay? When is it not? How do we adjudicate that? How do we converse about that with each other? When we make when we go too far one way, can we have confidence that it's going to move back the other. That's going to ultimately be the political context that has to be quote unquote healthy. But yeah, Marcus, thank you. And I'm not sure, Mark, when you got to the point of saying that Maryland was going to be Catholic, I made that very same point earlier. That's liberal. The liberal concept that I have would be open to that.
Right.
As long as it's in the context of a healthy politics, let's say.
Right. But see, this is what I'm pointing at. Liberal from what? Liberal to do what? Right? Freedom from what? Freedom to do what? Right? This is always where these frameworks fall down, because they're not starting from a reasonable, known, agreed upon context. That's why I think you can reinflate classical liberalism. And Marcus, I mean, I like Smith. It's fine. Been to his grave. Interesting. Right.
I have to, yeah.
But what do you say, Mark, about the Bill of Rights? What is the Bill of Rights? What is that?
Well, the Bill of Rights is just an instantiation by you have to understand it in a very large context. The Bill of Rights is an instantiation by the people that they want these certain assumptions encoded on paper. That's all it was. Because it was basically
too late. Bill of Rights, is there not?
It's too late to put it in the Constitution, right? Oh, everybody. I mean, no one's gonna violate those. Come on, that's right. It is. It's sort of like saying, well, we don't need to restate the 10 Commandments because everybody knows thou shalt not kill. It's like, yeah, but the people were like, nah, bro, we want this on paper. That's really all it was. I mean, it's very clearly the history of that document.
And in retrospect, It's a good thing we did put it on paper.
Well, yeah. I mean, they agreed to do it, and they did it. They just didn't want to hold up, everything else.
What's wrong with what would be wrong with this conformulation? And that is that the liberty that you're talking about is the liberty to do everything except, and then the except is really what defines what we're talking about. And so it's really more about constraint than it is about liberty.
You need a framework that says that, this is why the classical is important, the way I defined it. You need a framework that not just states these things, we'll say axiomatically, right? Like, it's bad to take people's private property, except if they're dumping toxic chemicals in the river, in which case eminent domain is okay, which I agree with, by the way, right? Like, there's no way to do that. You need to have justifications. When you point back to Plato, say, for example, in Plato's Republic about justice, like the justifications in Plato, right? You can go back and look. You don't take my word for it, right?
Everybody has their reasons. Ultimately, this would be worked out in the form that I was talking about in terms of something that would be called healthy politics. And maybe we don't have healthy politics anymore. And that will ultimately undermine the whole thing. But
I don't think you can work it out, Jim. I think you have to start from baseline assumptions. This is what I'm pointing at. Everybody's missing. There's a framework, right? And we're all embedded in frameworks. You kind of alluded to this earlier where you said, like, well, I'm firmly, boomer, and there's not much I can do about it. Yeah. And so my view is skewed, right? And that's an amazing amount of, we'll say, self-awareness or something, whatever weird psychological term we want to use. And fair enough. You're a very bright guy. You're super aware, right? So the problem becomes you can't just say liberalism, right? But you can say classical liberalism, because again, you're modifying the word with a framework that's pre-existing. It's very rich and it's very easy to understand, and it's already pre-justified. And then when you do that and you add, as Marcus rightly points out, although everything Marcus said was kind of bottom up and emergent, which just to me, that's the wrong way to think about it. And I don't think the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers thought of that way about it either. I think we're doing them a disservice. Like, I think they understood everything comes from God.
Depends which part of their thought you're talking about. But
Yep. Fair enough. But
the idea of emergence, social emergence, is in sometimes considered the hallmark of the Scottish Enlightenment. So Adam Ferguson's phrase that we're studying the products of human action, but not of human design. Now, there's still top down going on there, whether, there's still principles of nature.
For them, Marcus. Yeah. But when we read it, the top down's not there already. Well, this is the corruption of education. This is my point. Like, but anybody born, say, past 1950 or something probably doesn't have that built in, right?
Yeah, So to Jim, I basically agree with you on the healthy politics point, but then the point that I'd remind you of, that, and that's the thing I've been trying to say about education, because I think it's the best example, is there are certain things that healthy politics between groups with different cultural or religious assumptions, within reason, not, people that believe we should be slaughtering people on the streets or whatever, within reason, you can only handle so much controversy at once, in a sense. And so the part of the purpose of restraints on government is to make sure that those controversies come at a relatively slow stream, right? So that we can handle point by point at a time, maybe come to different compromises. But if you just say, oh, okay, so now we have to decide what all kids will believe, we can't handle that. It's hard to have, our health.
There's an effort of that in the Constitution, of course, ranging from the Congress, which is a 2-year election, all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is a lifetime appointment. And we have, we have at least the ideal of it, the aspiration of that is embedded in the Constitution.
Yeah, so the idea of a constitution or republicanism, or all the theory that goes on in the Federalist Papers, is trying to set up a system to sort of act as sort of like boundary rings for the boxing combat that politics really is. Right?
An aspiration, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, politics in the U.S. sense, the thing that they refer to as politics in Europe is completely different, which is very interesting, right? Because in Europe, they understand politics is just like what happens when you have a group of people, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas here, it's very specifically around governance for some stupid reason. And so our conception of politics is very flat and very strange to the rest of the world. But we're using the same word, right? And so, but a lot of things are like that, like nation, which I'm going to talk about at 7 p.m.
There are a lot of competing definitions.
That's the same deal. I mean, we destroyed that word completely. The United States actually destroyed that term. Totally, utterly.
Okay, well, Mark Parker's on deck too, by the way.
Yeah.
The Mark Parker.
Hey, Mark.
I came in for the UBI. Can you hear me? Testing.
Yeah.
I came in for the UBI, but I'll stay for this because.
You can redirect back to the UBI if you have something you'd like to add.
Absolutely, if time and interest allows. Mark's analysis fails, and this discussion, all due respect, gentlemen, fails because with regard to property rights and constitutional law in the United States, is the Constitution does speak very much to individuals, but in a very strange and subtle way. When it defines certain persons as being 2/3 persons in the Constitution, it instantiated slavery, the right to property, human chattel, as a right in the Constitution, until that right was broken by the Civil War and the subsequent amendments. And you can't really interpret the Constitution without going through, a lot of simpletons will say, read the Constitution and say, my constitutional rights are this, and they point to some line in the Constitution, when in fact there's 250 years of Supreme Court decisions that have given shape and meaning to the Constitution in practical application. So much of what we've gotten ourselves into is the result of 250 years of success, of somehow surviving as a nation, even though we've destroyed the meaning of the word according to Mark. But we've survived for 250 years because we have this process of a constitution that is written, but is also interpreted in a very dynamic way. And now, I'll put a pin on a bow on it with this, is with Trump v. Casa Inc., this last decision, we may be entering into a new golden age of states' rights and a challenge to federal supremacy that the Supreme Court has just opened the door to with that decision, which I hope to talk to Nate about sometime. in the future. But it's but yeah, you cannot talk about you can't even talk about Americanism without talking about slavery, the history of slavery and the history of racism, both within the Constitution, within Supreme Court decisions and the law and society. And you guys have managed somehow to not, when talking about property rights, managed to completely forget that human beings were once property in this country, and not very long ago.
Well, because it's Independence Day, and I want to focus on the positive, and and the critiquing of America has been done to death, and we also have our woke right friends in the comments trashing America already, and I don't want to add anything.
But that's not trashing America. I said it was 250 years of success. We fought a war over the subject, and we won, or at least the decision won. I would say the right side of history won.
No dispute.
I would absolutely say, well, Abraham Lincoln. If you think Abraham Lincoln's a bad president,
I was just informed in the comment section that Abraham Lincoln is an absolute villain.
Yeah, some people think that, but those people are a tiny minority.
Lincoln destroyed the old liberal order and replaced it with a totalitarian French progressive state where the citizen is property of the state.
That's the first part is right. The last part is wrong, but the first part is right. Like, yes, he definitely did that. Right. And that what was necessary at the time. And that is actually the function of the president of the United States, by the way, like explicitly. Like when there's an emergency, steps in, becomes king, does the king thing, and then steps out. That's how the federal government is designed to function.
There weren't a lot of other options on the table for Lincoln.
Yeah, and I'd say
cut him some slack.
I'd say that's true, and that a lot of the early classical liberal theorists would have recognized something like that, or an important role for something like that, especially in something like the Federalist Papers. But talking about Lincoln and the Civil War as if it was just like Lincoln just applying the law clearly on the South is part of what Cale was talking about of the lies, in a sense.
Right.
We were told that there's just the Constitution and then it was just executed like a program across time, when in reality, there were a lot of other cultural assumptions, struggles, illiberal actions taken. Illiberal not necessarily meaning wrong, but maybe extra legal illiberal actions taken to preserve the state because that were depending on a culture. And so not recognizing those things, or not trying to promote a culture that understands how to assess whether those things were right or wrong, including something like assessing whether the decision to not combat the slave states in the initial writing of the Constitution enough, you can also make a judgment call that was wrong, right? You can say,
what about the illiberal actions of the state that preceded the Civil War, like the overriding of some free states, then infringing upon the rights of free states to be free states by imposing the property rights of Southern slave owners into those states. So a runaway slave who's made it to a free state could and was given a safe haven in a state like Michigan, say.
Yeah.
And a Southerner could send bounty hunters, or actually U.S. Marshals even, to go retrieve human property in a free state, which helped. This is all part. That was illiberal too.
That's what caused it. To Marcus's point, there's one decision, Massachusetts, right? It's a backwards decision, and the court is the thing that wrecked everything because they made the right decision on paper and the wrong decision in implementation somehow, which anybody barely understands. The Civil War, people do not understand the Civil War. It is the most confused, ridiculous thing ever because, we lost a lot of the wealthy class in the Civil War because they went to war. And that was the last time that happened, at least in this country, right? Yeah. So it had a huge lasting effect because the courts effectively made the wrong decision.
U.S. GDP exploded after the Civil War. What are you talking about? Loss of wealth? Yes, a certain class of wealth was lost, but the economy absolutely exploded because it was now liberated from this nonsense.
The sons and daughters of the wealthy class, they're the ones that signed up for the war initially in the Civil War. and that actually caused a bunch of interesting things. There's I think it's Louis Menard has a book called The Metaphysics Club.
That's a good
but I never finished, but it's a good book. Like,
well, I would just go back to a point that I made a minute ago, which is that we all tell the story of the past in our present context.
Stories.
And what we are doing when we're doing that is we are defending, either explicitly and consciously or unconsciously, we're defending our present interpretation of the world. And my elegiac argument here is, and I've studied the Civil War as well, Mark, and I have my own opinions about it, that we still are faced with the responsibility to recognize the good. And that is very much complexifiable. Mark, you were very good at that, complexifying it with a string of historical references. And we can always recontextualize that, and we can undermine our own sense of ourselves if we please. But that doesn't abdicate, that doesn't remove the responsibility for us to sit down and try to recognize what we regard as the good and to try to pursue it. And for me, and again, it's my inheritance and my locked into my generation, for me, in terms of the narrow discussion we were talking about, it is expressed in this notion that I expressed and Marcus expressed as classical liberalism. I would expand it. Mark D. Parker, you expressed a more broad understanding of that history. I agree with you on that. That's a way of reinforcing the broader sense of what was ultimately a good thing, all things taken into account, and the history recognized that the United States and America and the West in general has brought to the table. And I'm ready to, in my weak way, try and honor and defend that.
What's the story, Jim, that you're going to tell people of classical liberalism that is different from the story? Because I agree with you. I mean, the story is key to everything. But what's the story you're going to tell people to differentiate it from, quote, liberalism? Because that again, back to my original question.
Did you read the article that I wrote on Substack or no?
No, I didn't read your Substack article. Sorry.
I've already said that there's a use of the word that it really is referring to political progressivism. The use of the word liberal when it's set as opposed to
what's the positive classic liberal case?
Say again?
What's the story of the classical liberal case? Like, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and therefore property rights are fixed? Like,
what I said a minute ago is everybody has their reasons. And one of them is a genealogical reason, which you're trying to ask me to produce. I don't think genealogical defense is the only way to defend principles.
Well, but you said story. I agree with story. I just want a story. Like,
but all of these are
I tried to give one early. I tried to give one early. I want to give Matt a chance to talk because Matt's been hanging out for a while now, while you guys are going back and forth. So I actually might want to say, but I'm going to wait and let Matt talk first because he's been patiently waiting to say his 2 cents here. Matt, what do you have to say?
Oh, I have nothing to say. I was just here to say hi. Like, there's so much going on in the background, but just want to make sure that you guys are not late to your local community parade. Love you guys. Have a great 4th.
Yeah, you too, Matt. All right, thanks.
I was just going to say, I think it's important. I think all of us agree, like, story is really what is ultimately being fought over here, right? And so we're reworking, the story of the post-war consensus. We're reworking the story of the founding. We're reworking the story of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. But I think it's probably important to say, I'll say it here, stories are not solutions. They're achievements, and so therefore they're kinds of a way of structuring trade-offs. And so I think we are now in this moment where we're trying to what is the Darth Vader line? I'm altering the deal. I'm reworking sort of this story, and so I think that's why it's kind of fraught. But we can't pretend that there's a solution as such. That it'll just once we sort of implement the right story, then everything is just sort of fine. I think that's not how it works.
I hate to bring it to
I think
you,
stories
Zach,
are
you're
for
closer to
specific
woke right
people.
than you think you are.
Wait,
Like,
what?
Because you have a shared love of Marxism.
That's
So
fine.
anyway,
And that's fine. I mean, Marxism is a story.
no.
Well,
Just
an anti-story, for sure. Yeah, it's, I mean, but I think stories are for people. I mean, I think, you know, I don't like this post World War II consensus thing. It's the flattest way ever to talk about an actual myth, or mythos is probably the better term for the World War II thing. And I've got a whole a stream
Yes.
on that. And
well,
the
like I said in
monologues
my
is a separate
conversation
video,
with
but-
Sam, it's like, you know, it's a lot of these people that are deconstructing the mythology of World War II, and there is a mythology to it.
Story. Well, they're
grant that.
deconstructing the story, I think, Nate. I
Right,
don't think I don't think they can deconstruct a mythology. And I don't think they were handed the mythology. I think they were handed the story.
Well, my point is, it's still a performative contradiction, because these are the very same people who will talk about how we should honor the mythologies of the past, and we shouldn't look with a critical modern eye.
Right.
And we look back at these old stories and that they have value, and that we shouldn't just
get
discard
trapped.
them.
Well,
But
they get trapped in postmodernism, which
Right,
says
exactly
you can
right.
define your own stuff. And
Yeah.
of course, almost no one can. Like, I don't think anybody here can. Like, we're all stupid, basically. We can't do that. This is, you know, I saw a video the other day, and this woman, it's actually a fantastic video. It's posted on my Discord server, but she went through this whole thing about Tolkien and the fantasy genre. And at the end, her thesis is, well, the only reason we don't have another Tolkien is because of the publishing industry and these constraints and formulas we put on ourselves. And I'm like, honey, how are you an author and you don't understand that the reason we don't have another Tolkien is because maybe we get one every 2 generations if we are so fortunate, right? Like, people don't have any sense for how varied and how important and how deep the hierarchy is. And so they end up in these traps of trying to deconstruct, right, something that's way beyond their intellectual capacity. And to be fair, almost everybody's, because it was built up by what John Vervaeke would call distributed cognition. And so you're not going to be able to understand something that was built by a mind or group of minds over time that easily. Like, that's just not, and to the extent that people
and you're
can,
recapitulating the very same error that you're critiquing.
Exactly. Because you
Like-
have to. You're trapped. You're
Right.
trapped in your own perspective. Your personal, private perspective traps you. And then if somebody tells you, no, you can step outside of that because postmodernism, bro, and then you can deconstruct. And I'm like, you can't do any of that. What you're going to deconstruct the history of, say, the United States, or even just the post-war history of the United States, right? You're not going to do that. First of all, if you think there's such a thing as World War II, you're so lost. There's no hope for you. There's no such thing as World War II. Like, there was a battle as part of a great war, but if you try to carve that out and say World War II, your frame is so off, you're not going to get anywhere. You're never going to get anywhere. You're missing so many.
Okay, let's whoa, back up for a second. Okay, World War II. Marcus will know this, right? Mark, how long from the Civil War to World War II, the United States represented something like 25% of GDP, right? And just as it is today, goes up or down a little bit, but basically from the Civil War to World War II, U.S. is 25% of GDP. World War II hits. Okay, Hitler invades Poland. By the end, and Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. By the end, we have Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Europe's decimated. The United States has a GDP, the global share of GDP the United States represents is 50%. Okay, 50% of GDP is American. Now, that's real. You can say there's nothing. That wasn't a real event, or this wasn't something called. No, that's a substantive historical event or series of events.
Things change, and as the result of
it was a dramatic
Great
change.
War in Europe, we took over the economic power of the world. How else could it have unfolded? Otherwise, there wouldn't have been one, because Europe couldn't rebuild itself.
What's the point you're trying to make, though, Mark? I don't understand.
The point is that it was a real event. He's saying this is something. It's like there wasn't a thing called World War II or whatever. I don't even know what you're talking about, because in the real, like, you guys are talking about stories, people with real power, economic and political, relational, are actually drinking our milkshakes, right? I mean, You can have your stories. They'll let you have your stories all day long, like opiate to the masses. But that, in the end, the people with real power are going to shape things, and real power, real economics represents real power and real influence. And that's what really shapes things. It's like the United States. You guys were talking about how ideology, philosophy, and various thoughts shaped the United States. The United States was basically lucky. It was a continent-sized island with no natural predators for the first 150 years of its existence, or if not more. It had, basically 150 years. First 150 years, no natural predators. It operated at liberty on the continent, and it expanded because it was very, very fortunate.
Did you forget the part where we had to win a war against the most powerful nation on earth in order to achieve that?
But we didn't.
We didn't win it by ourselves, though, of course. We won it because the French intervened.
We didn't win any war at all. That didn't actually, see, this is the point. Like, World War II as a war is a story, right? That's the World War II consensus story that is false. In the same way that we won a war against England is a ridiculous frame. What happened was there's a war between France and England, and they're fighting over our territory. And in the middle of that, half of their colonies of England revolted successfully. The other half refused to join us, by the way, which is a little interesting tidbit. And then the reason why that succeeded is only because we were left alone, effectively, because England couldn't spare the resources, and France, which we bankrupted, by the way, to build our country, France kept England busy elsewhere and threatened, like, the other colonies, for example, the ones that hadn't broken away. And so they both thought that they were going to end up with us in the end, as I alluded to earlier, right? Like, the story that we were in a war and that we won is a story. It's a ridiculous story. But to get back to the point, if you think World War II is a thing,
I for one, I'm looking forward. I think that's just cynical. I mean that's exactly the kind of, like,
it's not even true. It's cynical, and it's not true. It's like saying to a hunter-gatherer. No, it's like saying, well, a hunter-gatherer, take a hunter-gatherer.
He's not telling a total lie. There are elements. I want to acknowledge that there are definitely elements of truth in the picture that Mark is presenting, but to deny that Americans played any role in achieving their own independence is
I didn't deny it. I just said we didn't have a war, in that way. It's not that we didn't win the occupation battles, because there were a couple of them, right? I mean, there's 1812. Right, like everybody skips over that. Like, yeah, we won 1812, two same reasons, right? England was highly distracted and couldn't really do much, and we got we had really, really good, capable generals. Like, the story. But
you're needlessly adding noise to the signal. This is the problem with your thinking patterns, is you're adding noise where it's not necessary. It's like saying, because events changed, we don't have a real story. No, it's like, okay, take a hunter-gatherer, let's just say you're in a little tribe of hunter-gatherers. The good berries to eat are over here. And down there, you go fishing for the really good fish are in that creek. Okay? Oh, but there's a flood. And so the berry crop is no longer, the good food isn't here or there. You now have to find food elsewhere. Circumstances change. It doesn't mean that the story that they told the children that go get the berries here and the fish there was wrong. It's just circumstances change. That's, like I said, after World War II, the United States represented 50% of global GDP. It doesn't anymore. Circumstances change.
The problem with Mark's story is that it's not a story in the way that the actual story of the American Revolution that we have told each other for a very, very long time is really a story. It has heroes, it has villains,
that's correct.
It has conflict, it's a fucking story, okay?
Right. Right.
And we
And there's
needed to
and
be
there's
a
a
story.
mythos around that, Nate.
All that nuanced historical critical bullshit does nothing for us
No,
as a
it,
people.
no, it does something very important for certain people as a people. And the important thing is it shows all of these stories can be, quote, deconstructed. Okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't change the truth of them, by the way, right? Because the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, 13 colonies broke away from the world power of the day.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do, Mark. I want to point people back away from the deconstructed stories toward the stories that were deconstructed, because those are as important to us as Americans as the stories that the same people who are in the business of most rapidly trying to deconstruct those stories, as the stories that they want to look back to and uphold are for whatever it is that their agenda is.
Right. But it's more important, Nate. Like, we need those stories because that's what built the country, right? George Washington absolutely did not lie about chopping down the cherry tree, as far as I'm concerned. Anybody who says differently is wrong about everything.
All right,
like,
then we're on the same page then, Mark.
It's vitally important to keep those stories in place for the people that need those stories, who aren't ready, able, and willing to dig into these other things. But that is my way of saying, look, you can dig all you want, right? But unfortunately, all you're going to find is more to dig for, right? Because you're not hitting a stopping point. The stopping point with classical liberalism is we're just going to take Plato and the successes of Rome for granted, and then we're going to use that as a base to say we want freedom within the constraints set out by Plato, by the Roman Republic, and by Jerusalem. That's what we want. Okay, that's easy to do, right? Because we can independently reference the books and come to largely the same conclusion about what they say. There's a little nitpicking here and there. Who cares, right? But I don't see how you're going to get anything else that could replace a definition that has that depth, so that you can then push off of that and say the story of classical liberalism is the Scottish Enlightenment, right? And that is what birthed the new and progressive government of the United States, that is wholly unique and has not even been tried to be emulated since, only because no one understands it. And so when France tries it, they can't do it. When England tries it, they can't do it.
It's completely dependent upon a certain combination of things that only existed in the Anglosphere at a certain period in history. There's no way, there would be no way of exporting it anywhere else.
I agree with that. I mean, Jonathan Peugeot says, he said in a couple places, I don't understand how America, ended up to.
Yeah, but he's francophone. What he shouldn't. I don't know if he even has the possibility of getting it.
I agree, and I have a thesis on that. It's in my history videos on my channel, right? So there's very clear, in my mind, a clear reason why we slipped through the cracks, if you will, and defied the odds, or however you want to frame it, and that argument's laid out in my history videos. But basically, the important part there is you are not qualified to deconstruct the story, right? And that's where everyone gets upset, because postmodernism is a type of individualism that tells you, oh, of course you can set your own frame. Of course you can interpret Moby Dick. You can't interpret Moby Dick. I did a Moby Dick book club on Father Eric's channel, and just the depth that's there about what's in that book is ridiculous, because everybody brought some, their own perspective.
Well, I think I would want to push back a little bit, Mark, because I don't think you don't mean that you can't interpret it. You mean you can't exhaustively interpret it, because there will be meaning there that you may not be able to access because it has such depths that there will always be more to get out of it than you can possibly draw from it.
Yeah,
I don't think that's true as a single interpreter.
I don't think that's true of say a story, but it might be true of a great book, and only a great.
You were
book,
talking about Moby Dick,
right? Well, not all books. Well, but see, now this is where it's important, right? Tolkien, inexhaustible. Probably everything involving what we'd call fantasy or elves or whatever after that, completely flat garbage. Like no need. It's not deep, right? But that's actually really important. But more importantly, you shouldn't. You should take the damn story you're given and you should roll with it, because it has a utility that has been proven through time to produce a particular result.
That's where I want to agree with you, is that we really need to do more to honor the story that we're given. And that's like what I think we're not doing.
Right. No, exactly. And that's the case I want to bolster, because again, you can always tear down the myth of World War II. You can always tear down the Civil War and rip it apart and make Lincoln the bad guy. Like, you can do that. Like, that's not very hard. Also, 4-year-olds can do that. So, I mean, you can, I guess, if you want to be a 4-year-old, but that's the problem. Like, and should you? So Sally Joe brought this up to me. Like, should a housewife in the Midwest know about mass deportations and the fact that it turns out, big shock to everybody, I'm sure, they're not perfect. And so they end up, people get snagged in the deportation net that maybe aren't hardened criminals. Oh well. But should they be worrying about that? Or should they be worrying about making sure that the kids go to school and the cows get out to pasture and all the things that they need to do to keep people like us fed, right? Because the Midwest feeds us, like, actually, right? So I don't want them worrying about that. I don't want them knowing about that. I don't even want them hearing about what's going on in the Middle East or what's going on at the federal level with deportations or the latest political I don't want them hearing any of that. It's not good for them. Well, they need to stick to the stories they can handle.
That's possibly true, Mark, but when you're in a democracy, supposedly there's some ambiguous responsibility that everyone has to pay attention to these issues and make some sort of comment on it, right? But those kinds of things go overboard. People's political responsibilities and anxieties and uncertainties go overboard, specifically when you have a government doing illiberal things. That's when you need mass mobilization for democracy. Instead, normally you could have a large portion of the population go, I will take care of my farm, and I'll take care of my farm for the rest of my life, and my kids will take care of the farm after them, barring, mass structural changes in the economy. But they can't, because these particular domains in which the government is acting in major, huge ways are illiberal. They're not. It's unclear how they're going to be constrained by the Constitution.
Marcus, I don't know how you're judging that, but more importantly, thank God we don't live in a democracy. Like, whew, man, that's a lot of responsibility I don't want.
Yeah, but there are democratic elements to our politics, no doubt.
I'm glad. Yeah, there's democratic elements to everything, though. That's part of the problem with the definition of democracy, right? It just means that everybody has a say. Okay, everybody has a say. So what? Who cares?
Yeah.
Even in 1840, Tocqueville called his book "Democracy in America." Yeah. It's nuanced. It's a democratic republic. Arguably, would be the precise descriptor.
Not arguably, it is a democratic republic. Now, okay, so I think we need to go ahead and give people a chance to give some closing thoughts, because it is my son's birthday and I'm going to make him a late breakfast because he's sleeping in. So with no further ado, we'll kind of start with Jim. And what closing thoughts do you have for this stream, Jim?
Well, I mean, a very kind of rich and meandering in some respects conversation, but ultimately, I think the where I started maybe is where I finish. I think I have this worry that the general sense of aspiration towards, yes, vaguely defined principles that I think have been and are valuable, independent of what genealogy you may put on them, Mark, are valuable in our culture and have been instantiated in our culture and are available to us still to this day to honor and stand behind. And I feel a bit weary, maybe in my old age, about it, and I see future generations standing in different places, and maybe that's healthy because we have an open society, but maybe it's concerning that we're trying to move to something beyond that, and that makes me concerned, makes me worried, makes me want to be a reactionary liberal in that sense.
Marcus?
Yeah, I guess I just want to re-echo the thing that Kale said earlier about feeling lied to by a certain portion of the conservative classical liberal function. And it's basically something that I've slowly come to realize over the last few years that should be very clear, and such that some sort of classical liberal contingent or ideology can move forward and be more robust to all these differences or all the stream of events that we'll experience in the future, which is that liberalism is incomplete as a set of commitments, right? And you have to be honest about that in a sense. It can still be a core commitment, the idea that the government should generally stay out of the daily lives and property of its citizens. That can still be a core commitment, but it's not a commitment that sufficiently governs or guides everything in political life. So understanding that liberalism needs to be complemented by these other things, and that those other debates, those other healthy politics that Jim wants us to have, can be approached, and you can you can develop a culture like that. It starts with yourself, obviously, going out and treating people more liberally in conversation and stuff. But not treating liberalism as another totalitarian ideology. Then you end up with a French Revolution and not an American or Scottish Enlightenment kind of set of commitments. So that's the kind of thing I've been working on. I have a couple published articles basically trying to develop those points. So maybe I'll share those with you guys later. But
Oh yeah,
I agree with you, Marcus.
Yeah.
Mark.
Which one?
Sure. Look, we need stories. We need to just stop deconstructing every story that comes along and saying I can deconstruct it, therefore someone lied to me, and that's the problem. And now because the minute you create a problem, you have to come up with a solution, or someone does. And what you'll, I think, notice if you look around is everyone's solution is to have somebody else do the work, right? Whether it's, well, the government needs to do this, or Elon needs to start his own political party, or, whatever it is, so-and-so needs to be in charge of the Federal Reserve because, your primary frame is economic instead of political or something, right? And because we're breaking into those tribes, because we think through individualism and, to be fair, materialism, that we've been given the tools to do so. We're now, quote, deconstructing these things that we're not smart enough to understand how they came to be, and everyone's lazy and doesn't do 10 minutes of research on the super powerful internet that we all have in our hands to kind of figure out, no, these are very structured, nuanced stories that are there for your protection. And the minute you do away with them, you are in a world of trouble for yourself. But more importantly, you open the door to powers and principalities, if you will. I hope I'm using that in the Peugeot way, that you cannot imagine. And the reason why that's a problem is because you need to start where the founders of this country started. If you want to talk about liberalism, which I do think comes straight from our revolution, right, or so-called revolution, and that is, this doesn't work without a common sense of God. Like, if you don't start there and then go down the stack from the emanation down, you're just going to have a lot of problems, and you're going to create a lot of problems that can't be solved in the world needlessly. These problems don't necessarily need to exist. You can say, oh, we've had this in the past. Let's just go revivify it. Let's make it what it once was, or maybe we can make it better than it once was. And no one's willing to do that anymore for whatever reason.
Thank you. Mark Parker?
My neighbor's heroes aren't a threat to my heroes. There are a lot of people, with different stories, different histories than my own. Their histories don't threaten my history. I think so much of this anxiety over the loss of an American unifying narrative is a kind of intuitive xenophobia. We need to let go, widen our arms, embrace as many as we can, get to know people from their points of view. That it's interesting. We can't. You're going to find the history of the heroes of a black community are going to be different than the heroes that many white people know, and they don't even know the stories of Black Americans or Mexican Americans in this country, even though Mexico owned half this country for a big long time. It's get to know other people's stories. It doesn't not going to threaten you. You're going to be okay. America's going to be okay, even if Washington and Lincoln have to take a little step down in the hierarchy. They're still going to be way up there. We can have Martin Luther King in there too. We can have other heroes. W.E.B. Du Bois, a radical sort of black civil rights leader. These heroes can be on our Mount Olympus together, because in the end we have to be the ones who live in today and get along today. So I don't know if that's meant anything to anybody, but that's it.
All right, thank you, Mark. Kale.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Nate. It's been a lot of fun. We really do need to do this again.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it's important, generally speaking, and in the context of this conversation, to pay attention to what I've heard other people call border patois, right? It's that conversation between sort of two polities. There's this liminal space between things, and there's a kind of conversation and a kind of language that you're allowed to say and give voice to that is by definition not the mainstream. And it doesn't mean you have to take everything that the border patois says overly serious, but I do think it's important. It offers you a kind of perspective with which can help us make sense out of things. And so these and remember, borders can happen between spaces, borders can happen between generations, borders, there's these distinct kinds of conversations that I appreciate your upset, Nate. I appreciate your pushback, because that is a kind of border patois to a body of conversation that's happening that are rightly kind of raising flags for you. And so becoming aware of that and being conscious of that conversation, I think, is important, and I think it can ultimately be generative. And one of the ways in which border patois can be either diffused or inserted or injected is part of this sense making that I think we're trying to engage in. And the talk about these stories, these big narratives, I think it's important to recognize all of the stuff that's been kind of left out of this achieved consensus, this achieved story. And when we see and feel those stories pulling apart a little bit, my recommendation is to pay attention to those kinds of conversations, even if you feel like those conversations are dangerous. So,
all right. Well, thank you. I guess I'll just offer my own closing thoughts. So, unless you want to end up this kind of cynical, 1776 was an anti-Christian, self-crowning. Right. No Christian in their right mind should honor it. It's just like Lucifer and Paradise Lost. Then I would suggest that you maybe take a break from the internet, drink an American beer, eat some barbecue, and blow some stuff up, because it's the 4th of freaking July. So everyone have a great day and enjoy the rest of your day in real life, in the flesh, hanging out with friends and family, and doing some great American pastimes.
Thanks, Nate.
So,
thanks, Nate.
As long as anti-liberals in your area haven't outlawed fireworks, go blow some stuff up.
Thanks, Nate. See you guys.
All right, guys.
Talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.